Hello, friend. Get comfortable. Before we begin tonight, I know there are 1,000 other ways you could be spending this hour, and the simple fact that you chose to spend it here, in the quiet dark, means more than you would probably guess. If a story like this one has ever helped carry you off to sleep before, a like and a subscribe helps this small channel find its way to someone else out there who needs exactly that too. While you settle in, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere quiet in Ohio, or a soft rain falling outside a window somewhere in the north of England, or maybe a house just outside Sydney, a dog curled up nearby, the phone screen turned down low so it will not catch your eyes. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I always read every single one, and I mean that. All right then, let us begin. It is not the great hall we're walking into tonight. Forget the banners and the long oak tables and the roaring fire big enough to roast an ox. The version of medieval life you have seen in films 100 times. That is not where most people lived, and it is not where we are going tonight either. We're going somewhere much smaller, much darker. A single room, low-ceilinged, built of timber and wattle and daub, the walls the colour of wet clay. The thatch above holding in a warmth that smells faintly of straw and old smoke. It is not yet light outside. The window, if you can call it that, is a narrow slit stuffed with a scrap of oiled cloth, and through it comes the thinnest grey suggestion that morning exists somewhere beyond this room, though it has not arrived yet. This is the home of a family we will call the Fletchers, though of course that was not always a surname yet in this century, more a description of what the father did with his hands. Adam is his name. He is somewhere in his 30s, which in this world already makes him a man well into the second half of his expected life. His wife is Alison, younger by a few years, her hands rough in a way that tells you everything about how she spends her days. They have 3 children sharing the single sleeping space along the wall, opposite the hearth, and an elderly grandmother, Adam's mother, who sleeps nearest the fire because the cold settles into old bones first and stays longest. There is a sound in the room already. Faint, rhythmic. It is Alison, awake before anyone else, kneeling at the hearth in the near dark, working at something small and careful with her hands. She's not making the fire. Not yet. She is checking it. And this is the first strange thing I want you to know about, because it is not obvious at all, and almost nobody thinks about it anymore. This family has not lit a fire from nothing in years, perhaps not ever. Fire, in a world without matches, without anything resembling a modern ignition, is not something you casually create each morning. It is something you keep alive. Overnight, before sleep, the fire is not extinguished. It is smothered, carefully, deliberately, banked under a heavy blanket of ash so that a small ember survives at the centre, starved of air just enough to slow it to almost nothing, but never quite to nothing. The word for this practice, in the Old French the Normans brought with them, was couvre-feu. Cover the fire. You have heard that word before. It became, eventually, curfew. The nightly ritual of banking a hearth fire is the direct ancestor of a word you use to mean something about laws and being indoors by a certain hour, and almost nobody who says it now has any idea it began as something so tender as this. A woman kneeling in the dark, protecting a single glowing coal, the way you might protect a small flame cupped in your hands against wind. Alison leans close now, blows gently, once, twice, a soft and practised breath, and the ember answers her, a small orange pulse, then a thread of smoke, then, coaxed with dry tinder she keeps in a pouch at her waist for exactly this purpose. A flame. It is such a small motion. It is also in this world one of the most important things she'll do all day, because if that ember had died overnight, if the ash blanket had been too thin or the wood too damp, there would be no fire this morning at all, and getting one would mean walking to a neighbour's house, cap in hand, to ask for a burning coal carried carefully home in a clay pot, an errand of quiet embarrassment that every household in the village dreaded and every household, at some point, had to make. The children stir at the sound and the smell of new smoke. There are 3 of them. Marjorie, the eldest at 11, Wat, 9, named for his uncle, and little Ellen, not yet 5, who sleeps closest to her grandmother and wakes first simply because the old woman coughs in her sleep and the sound travels. None of them get up right away. There is a moment, brief and universal, that has not changed in 800 years, where a child pretends to still be asleep for just a few more seconds of warmth before the day insists otherwise. And here is something that will surprise you, something that quietly upends what you probably assumed about how families slept in a house like this. They do not sleep in individual beds, not even close, and it is not simply a matter of poverty, though poverty is genuinely part of the story. Sharing a bed, sometimes the entire family in one shared sleeping space, sometimes several children top to tail in a single narrow bed, was not considered strange or crowded. It was considered sensible. Warmth was survival, in a very literal sense, through the coldest months, and there was no shame attached to bodies pressed close for heat. Privacy, as you understand the word, as something owed to a person simply for existing, was not really a concept that applied here in the way it applies to you tonight. Alone or nearly alone in your own bed, in your own room, with a door that closes, that is worth sitting with for a moment. Not because it was worse, necessarily, just because it was so entirely different, a whole different agreement about what a body was owed and what it was not. Alison does not wake them yet. There is a rhythm to this house, a running order that never changes, and it begins with her alone at the hearth, before anyone else is called into the day. She adds 2 more pieces of wood. Not much, just enough to build the flame into something steady, and swings the small iron pot on its hook so it hangs directly over the growing heat. Inside is yesterday's pottage, thickened with barley, and this too is a small strangeness worth pausing on. The pot is almost never fully emptied and fully cleaned between meals the way you might imagine. It is topped up. Whatever remains from the night before gets more water, more grain, whatever vegetable happens to be at hand, and simmers again. Some households kept a pot going in some fashion for days at a stretch, each meal built on the bones of the last. There is a kind of thrift in that which feels almost foreign now. In a world of individually plated meals made fresh each time, and yet there is something quietly comforting in it too. Nothing wasted. Nothing wholly new. Just continuation. Adam is awake now, sitting up on the low straw mattress, and here is a detail that tends to catch people off guard the moment they hear it. He slept in his shirt. Not pyjamas. Nothing built for the purpose of sleep specifically, just the linen undergarment he wore beneath his clothes the day before, the one piece that stayed on through the night while the outer layers came off and were folded more or less onto a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. Full nakedness in sleep was not unheard of among the wealthy, oddly enough, who sometimes slept bare beneath heavy fur coverlets in heated chambers, but for a working family like this one, the shirt stayed on, both for warmth and for a kind of practical modesty in a room shared by parents, children, and grandmother alike. He stretches, and the frame of the bed creaks under him, a sound worth mentioning only because the bed itself would surprise you. It is not a soft thing. The mattress is a canvas or linen sack stuffed with straw, sometimes with a thinner layer of something called flock laid over the straw for anyone who could afford the added comfort, which this family mostly cannot. Underneath the straw sack, instead of a solid base, there is often a lattice of rope strung tight across the wooden frame, crossing and recrossing to hold the weight of the mattress above the frame. And this, it turns out, is where an entire phrase you still use today quietly comes from. Over weeks and months rope stretches, it sags, and so, every so often, someone has to go around the frame and tighten each cord again, pulling it taut. Sleep tight. That is where it comes from. Not some poetic wish for restful dreams, but a literal instruction about rope tension, the kind of practical household maintenance nobody thinks about until the bed starts sinking in the middle. Marjorie is up now too, moving to the corner where the family keeps its water, a wooden bucket filled the evening before from the village well so nobody has to make that walk in the dark. She does not wash her face the way you might imagine, with a splash of clean water and nothing more. Full washing of the whole body was rare, sometimes as infrequent as once a season for people of this station, and this had almost nothing to do with a lack of hygiene sense and everything to do with medical belief. Physicians of the era, drawing on very old ideas about the body's balance, genuinely believed that opening the pores through washing with water, especially warm water, could let dangerous air and disease directly into the body. Staying somewhat unwashed was not laziness. It was, in their understanding, a form of protection. What they did instead, daily, was what we would now call dry washing, wiping the face, neck and hands with a clean cloth, sometimes scented faintly with herbs, tending to the parts of the body that showed rather than the whole of it. It is strange to think about now, submerged as we are in daily showers, but it made a certain internal sense within everything else they believed about how illness travelled and how a body stayed well. What is dressing near the wall now, pulling on layer after layer in the practised quick sequence of a boy who has done this every single morning of his conscious memory? And this is where another quiet oddity slides into the morning without anyone in the room thinking twice about it. Underwear, in the sense you know it, barely exists for a boy his age and station. What he pulls on is the same linen shirt he slept in, and over that hose, which were not socks exactly but closer to long fabric leggings, each leg separate, tied at the top to a belt, or to the underside of a short tunic called a doublet in later centuries, or simply a kirtle in earlier ones. The two legs of the hose are not sewn together at all in the middle. There is a gap covered eventually by the hanging length of the tunic itself, and this arrangement, purely practical, purely about what fabric and stitching technology of the era allowed, meant that using the privy, or simply relieving oneself against a wall or a hedge on a long walk, required far less unfastening and far less fuss than you might assume looking at all those layers. Little Ellen is awake now too, and she does not get dressed on her own the way her older siblings do. Alison helps her. Quickly, efficiently, the two of them talking in the low half language of a mother and a very young child in the early morning, half real words and half sound. And here, folded into this small, ordinary moment, is something else worth knowing. Ellen wears, tied at the back of her simple woolen dress, a small cloth pouch, and inside it, a handful of dried herbs and a tiny fragment of coral, threaded so it cannot be lost. It is not decoration. It is protection, or at least it is believed to be. Coral, in particular, was thought across much of medieval Europe to guard young children specifically against the evil eye, against sudden unexplained illness, against the countless small dangers that could carry off a child in the first years of life with no warning and often no understood cause. You would find similar coral charms, slightly grander, hung around the necks of noble infants painted into portraits generations later. Here, in this house, it is humbler, just a fragment on a string, but the impulse behind it, the desperate protective love of it, is exactly the same. Breakfast, when it comes, is not really a meal in the way you would recognize one. There is bread, coarse and dark, made from a mix of rye and barley rather than the pale wheat bread reserved for wealthier tables, and there is a small cup of weak ale passed among the older children and the adults. Ale, not water, and this is worth pausing on because people often assume it reflects some kind of casual medieval drunkenness, when the truth is almost entirely practical. Well water in a crowded village could not always be trusted, and the brewing process, the boiling involved in making ale, killed off a great deal of what might otherwise make a person sick. So the ale brewed at home, small beer as it was often called, was weak, low in strength, more nourishing than intoxicating, closer to a thin malted drink than anything you would recognize as beer today. Children drank it. Grandmothers drank it. It was simply what you drank. Morning, midday, and night, because the alternative carried more risk than the mild fermentation ever did. And the bread itself carries a secret most people never learn. Later in the day, at the main meal, this family will not eat off plates in the way you picture a plate. They will eat off bread, a thick, dense slice, cut a few days old and gone slightly hard, called a trencher, set down at each place at the table, and the food, the pottage, the stewed vegetables, whatever meat there happens to be that day, gets ladled directly onto it. The trencher soaks up the juices and the fat as the meal goes on, and by the end, depending on the household and the day, it might be eaten too. soft now and flavoured with everything that sat on top of it. Or it might be set aside, given to the dogs that wait patiently near the table. Or gathered up entirely and given to the poor who came to the door, which happened more often than you would think, and which we will come back to. Outside, the village is beginning to stir in its own particular way, and what is sent out first before the meal, to see to the animals. This too surprises people, the closeness of it, the sheer proximity of livestock to daily domestic life. In a house like this one, it is entirely possible that a portion of the home itself, a partitioned section separated from the family's living space by nothing more than a low wall or a woven screen, houses a cow or a few goats or a handful of chickens overnight. The arrangement is called, in later academic language, a longhouse, and the logic behind it is simple and almost touching once you understand it. Animals generate heat. A cow breathing and shifting through a cold winter night raises the temperature of the whole structure by a meaningful amount. And in a world without any other reliable source of overnight warmth beyond a carefully banked ember, that heat is not a small thing. It is the difference, some nights, between a house that stays livable and one that does not. So the animals are not simply property, kept at a practical distance the way you might keep livestock now. They share the walls. They share, in a very real sense, the breath of the room. Marjorie's task this morning is different from her brother's entirely, and it tells you something quietly important about how firmly divided a child's world already was by this particular age, in this particular household. She is tending the hens, gathering what eggs there are, but she is also, quietly, watching Ellen while their mother works, because in a household like this, childcare is not a separate job assigned to one person. It is folded into everything else, passed along and shared between whoever has a free hand. An 11-year-old girl minding a 4-year-old sister while also managing chickens is not seen as too much to ask. It is simply how the morning gets done. And there is something else here worth knowing, something that would strike you as almost unbelievable if a modern parent suggested it. Children in this world, from a very young age, perhaps 6 or 7, are expected to begin contributing real, meaningful labour to the household, not symbolic chores but actual necessary work, because the household's survival genuinely depends on every set of hands being useful. Childhood, as a long protected stretch of years devoted mostly to play and schooling, is not really a concept that exists yet for a family of this station. It will not exist, not in the way you understand it, for centuries still. And yet I want to be careful here, because it is easy to hear that and picture something grim, joyless, a childhood stripped of anything soft. That is not quite right either. Children still played. There is good evidence, from objects found in the mud of old riverbanks and town ditches, of small toys, whistles carved from bone, dolls stitched from scraps of cloth, tiny wooden knights, spinning tops. What has a ball, in fact, stuffed tight with rags and stitched shut, sitting in the corner of the room, and there will be a moment later today, a short one, stolen between chores, when he and 2 boys from a neighbouring house kick it back and forth in the muddy lane outside, laughing in exactly the unself-conscious way children have always laughed at nothing in particular. Work was constant, but it was not the whole of the world, even here. The grandmother, meanwhile, has not yet risen from her place by the fire, and nobody in the household rushes her, nor would anyone ever think to. She is watching the room with the particular quiet authority that seems to come to certain older women in every century, saying little, missing nothing. Her name is Cecily, and she holds a position in this household that is easy to overlook if you are only thinking about who does the physical labour. She is, in a very real sense, the keeper of the family's memory and its rules, the one who remembers which saint's day falls when, which herbs treat which ailment, which neighbour cannot be trusted with a borrowed tool, which omens mean what. When Ellen stumbles slightly crossing the threshold a few minutes later, catching her toe on the raised wooden sill at the base of the doorway, it is Cecily who murmurs, almost without thinking, a small phrase, half blessing and half habit, because stumbling on a threshold, in the folk belief of the time, was thought to be a genuinely bad sign, an omen worth quietly countering with a word. The threshold itself, that raised strip of wood at the base of every doorway, was believed by some to be a boundary that spirits and ill luck gathered near, which is part of why a great many old customs about doorways, about not shaking hands across one, about a new bride being carried over one rather than walking across it herself, trace back to exactly this kind of thinking, deep and old and only half remembered even by the people practicing it. By now there is real light outside, grey still but real, and Adam has already gone to check on the strips of land his family works, part of the wider open field system shared among the village, where his holdings are not one solid block, but scattered across several different strips in several different fields, some rich soil, some poor, the whole arrangement designed generations earlier so that no single family got stuck permanently with only the worst ground. It is a system that would look, on a map, almost patchwork, oddly inefficient to a modern eye trained on tidy rectangular farms, and yet it worked, in its way, for hundreds of years, spreading risk and fairness across an entire community, bound together by land they did not fully own and could not simply leave. The village itself is waking in layers now, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys and roof holes at once, the smell of it settling low over the lane in the cool morning air, mixing with the sharper smell of animals and the green wet smell of the fields beyond. Somewhere, a dog barks twice and stops. A woman's voice calls a name. This is the sound of an ordinary morning here, unremarkable to everyone living inside it, and it is exactly this unremarkable ordinariness that I find myself wanting you to sit inside for a while tonight, because there is something deeply calming, I think, in realizing how much of it was simply life, quietly lived, no different in its essential rhythm from a morning in your own house today. Alison has an errand this morning that takes her out of the house entirely, into the lane and toward the small cluster of stalls that gathers near the church on market days, and it is worth walking with her for a moment, because a village market like this one runs on a set of unspoken rules that would feel utterly foreign if you stepped into them cold. There is no fixed price tag on anything. Every transaction is a small negotiation, a few words exchanged, sometimes a joke, sometimes a slow shake of the head, and a walk away that is really an invitation for the seller to reconsider, and Alison is good at this, practiced in the particular rhythm of it, the way you might be practiced at anything you have done 10,000 times without noticing you are doing it. She is looking for salt today, and salt, it turns out, occupies a strange and outsized place in this world, one that is easy to miss because it sits so cheaply on your own kitchen shelf now. Salt was not simply a seasoning here, it was one of the only reliable ways to preserve meat and fish through the long months when nothing fresh could be had, and because of that, it carried real value, real weight, both literal and social. A wealthy household salt cellar, the container that held it at table, was often the single most elaborate object on display, sometimes a genuine work of craftsmanship in silver or pewter, and where you sat at a long table relative to that salt cellar quietly told everyone present exactly how much you mattered. Sit above the salt, closer to the host, and you were someone of standing. Sit below it, further down the table, and everyone understood, without a word needing to be said, precisely where you fell in the order of things. Alison's family will never own a salt cellar worth mentioning, but the salt itself, however it is stored, however humbly, still matters enormously to whether the meat they manage to get this autumn survives the winter or spoils and is lost. Near the market stalls, a small commotion draws her attention briefly. Nothing serious, just a dispute between two men over the weight of a sack of grain, and it resolves itself the way most small village disputes did, not through any court or formal authority, but through the simple pressure of everyone else standing around watching, murmuring opinions, until one man backs down rather than lose face in front of neighbours he will see again tomorrow and the day after that and for the rest of his life. There is something in that worth noticing, an entire informal system of justice, built almost entirely out of reputation and the discomfort of being watched, doing quietly what written law did only rarely reach down to touch. The church bell rings while she is still among the stalls, not calling anyone to a service exactly, but marking the hour in the only way most people in the village have of knowing what time it actually is. Clocks, mechanical ones, exist by this point in certain great cathedrals and monasteries, enormous and expensive things tended by monks, whose entire purpose is keeping time correctly for the sake of prayer, but nothing like that exists here, in this small village, for this small family. Time is marked instead by bells, by the movement of the sun across a sky nobody measures precisely, by the position of shadows, by hunger, by habit. A day does not divide into 24 equal hours the way yours does. It divides loosely into periods of light and periods of dark, into the canonical hours the Church observes, prime and terce and sext and none and vespers, words that most of the village could not define exactly, but whose rhythm, whose bells, structure every single day of every single life lived here without exception. The church itself, when Alison passes it, is not the hushed, reverent, carefully lit space you might picture from photographs of surviving medieval cathedrals today, all stone and silence and stained glass glowing softly. It is loud. It is, in a way that would genuinely startle you, almost communal in a manner closer to a village hall than to a chapel. People talk during parts of the service. Dogs sometimes wander in. Market business gets quietly discussed in low voices along the back wall, while a priest conducts a mass at the front in Latin that most of the congregation cannot actually translate word for word, though they know its shape, its rhythm, the moments where you kneel and the moments where you rise, by long familiarity rather than comprehension. And the walls themselves, far from being bare stone, are covered riotously in paint, in vivid scenes of saints and devils and the Last Judgment rendered in reds and blues and golds that have mostly worn away by the time anyone alive today ever sees these buildings, leaving behind the pale grey stone that gets mistaken, centuries later, for medieval austerity, when the truth was closer to something loud and colourful and almost theatrical, a whole visual world designed to teach scripture to a congregation who could not read a word of it themselves. Back at the house, a visitor arrives not long after Alison returns, a travelling tinker passing through on his way toward the market town 2 days further along the road, and what happens next tells you something quietly important about how this world understood its obligations to strangers. He is given bread, he is given a place to sit by the fire and a cup of the small ale, and nobody asks him to pay for either, and nobody considers this remarkable, because hospitality toward a traveller, however humble the household offering it, was treated across most of medieval Europe as something close to a sacred duty rather than a simple kindness. Refusing shelter or food to someone genuinely in need on the road was thought to risk real spiritual consequence, tied up in old stories, some of them straight from scripture, about strangers who turned out, unrecognized, to be something more than they appeared. You fed the traveller because you did not know, could not know, who exactly you were feeding, and because someday, on some other road, it might be your own son or husband standing hungry at a stranger's door. The tinker eats quickly, thanks them plainly, and mends, in exchange, without being asked directly, but simply because it is understood as the natural shape of the exchange, a small tear in one of Adam's tools, a leather strap gone thin at the buckle. He is gone again within the hour, back onto the road, and the house resumes its rhythm as though he had never passed through at all, except that Ellen, for the rest of the afternoon, keeps humming a little scrap of a tune he taught her while he worked. 3 notes repeated, nothing more, the kind of small inheritance a stranger leaves behind without meaning to. The midday meal, when it comes, is the largest of the day, and this too runs against what you might expect. Dinner, the word itself, referred in this era to the meal eaten around midday, the main and heaviest meal, while what came in the evening was lighter, sometimes barely more than bread and cheese, called supper. The heaviest labour of the day happened in daylight, under the sun, and the body needed fueling for that, not for the hours afterward spent winding down towards sleep. It is, if you think about it for a moment, a far more sensible arrangement than the one most of us keep now. Heaviest meal saved for the exhausted end of the day, when the body least needs the fuel and most needs the rest. Today's pottage has been enriched with a little salted bacon Alison bought at market, and a handful of dried peas softened overnight, and the whole family gathers around the low table, trenchers set out, the grandmother served first as a matter of quiet, unquestioned custom, then Adam, then the children in descending order of age, Ellen last though never resentfully, because this is simply the order things have always happened, and nobody at this table has ever known it any other way. There is a blessing said before eating, brief, familiar, the words worn smooth by repetition, the way a stone step wears smooth under generations of feet. And then the sound of the meal itself, spoons against wood, the low murmur of a family talking about nothing very important, who saw whom at market, whether the rain holding off will hold off through the afternoon, whether the hen that has stopped laying is worth keeping through winter, or ought to go into a pot before the cold sets in properly. After the meal, while the men return to the fields for the afternoon's work, Cecily calls Marjorie over to the small shelf near the hearth where she keeps her herbs, bundled and dried, hanging in loose clusters from a peg driven into the wall. This is where a different kind of knowledge lives in this household, one that belongs almost entirely to the women, passed down mother to daughter to granddaughter, with almost nothing written down at all, because most of them cannot write and would not think to, since the knowledge has always simply lived in hands and memory, rather than on a page. Cecily shows Marjorie, not for the first time, how to tell yarrow from a look-alike weed that grows near it and does nothing useful at all, how much feverfew to steep for a headache, which root, boiled slowly, eases the ache that settles into joints during the wet months. This is medicine, real medicine, practiced daily in nearly every household across the countryside, almost entirely separate from the university-trained physicians who exist only in cities and serve only the wealthy. A woman like Cecily has, over 60 years, absorbed something close to a working pharmacology, tested against her own family's bodies again and again, refined through nothing more scientific than careful observation repeated across an entire lifetime. And not all of it, it must be said, would hold up under any kind of modern scrutiny. Alongside the yarrow and the feverfew sits a small stitched pouch containing a dried toad, flattened and strange, which Cecily believes, with complete sincerity, can be worn against the chest to ward off plague, should it ever again reach this village the way it reached her own mother's village 2 generations back, carrying off, in a matter of weeks, more than a third of the people who had ever lived there. It did not work, of course, not in any way we would recognize, but I find I cannot laugh at it, not really, sitting with it for a moment. It came from the same place as everything else on that shelf, a desperate, careful, loving attempt to keep the people in this house alive against forces nobody in this century had any real way of understanding. Some of it, the yarrow, the feverfew, actually worked, in ways modern medicine would later confirm through means Cecily could never have imagined. Some of it did not work at all. She had no way of telling which was which, and neither, really, could anyone else alive at the time. What is in the fields with his father this afternoon? Old enough now to be useful there, in a way he was not even a year or 2 ago, and the work itself is worth pausing on, because the tools involved would look, to modern eyes, almost impossibly simple, and yet an entire agricultural system, an entire way of feeding a country, rested on them. A wooden plough, its blade tipped in iron because iron is precious and only the working edge merits the expense, drawn by an ox rather than a horse in a household like this one, because oxen, while slower, are cheaper to keep and gentler on soil that has not been properly drained. Adam walks behind it, one hand steadying the plough, the other managing the ox with a long switch and a set of low, familiar commands the animal has heard so many times it barely needs them anymore. This single strip of land, this single afternoon's furrow, is a small piece of a rotation that spans years, one field left fallow, resting, while another grows wheat and a third grows something else entirely, barley perhaps, or beans, a rotation developed slowly over generations through nothing more sophisticated than trial, failure, and the accumulated memory of what happened the last time a field was worked a certain way, 3 years running. It strikes me, watching this, how much invisible calculation sits underneath what looks, from a distance, like simple labour. Adam is not simply walking behind an ox. He is holding, in his head, an entire working knowledge of soil, of season, of rotation, of weather signs, none of it written anywhere, all of it passed down the same way Cecily's herb lore was passed down, mouth to ear, generation to generation, refined slowly against the hard, unforgiving feedback of a bad harvest or a good one. Back inside, Alison has moved to the spinning, a task so constant in a household like this one that it fills nearly every spare hour that is not otherwise claimed by cooking, cleaning, minding children, or tending animals. She sits near the door where the light is best, a distaff tucked under one arm, wound with combed wool, and her fingers work almost without her conscious attention, drawing the fibre out, twisting it, letting the spindle drop and spin beneath her hand, catching it, winding on, letting it drop again. It is slow work, astonishingly slow by any modern measure, hours upon hours to produce even a modest length of usable thread, and this single fact quietly explains something that surprises most people the first time they hear it. Cloth, in this world, is expensive, genuinely expensive, in a way that has almost no modern equivalent, because the labour behind even a simple garment stretches back through weeks of spinning, then weaving, then fulling, then dyeing, each stage requiring its own skill and its own hours. A family like this one owns, in total, perhaps 2 or 3 changes of clothing per person, worn until they are threadbare, mended repeatedly, handed down from an older child to a younger one, cut down and restitched when a garment finally outlives its first wearer entirely. Nothing is discarded while it still holds together. A worn-out shirt becomes rags. Rags become, eventually, the very paper that a wealthier household somewhere might write on, since paper of this era was often made from exactly this kind of reclaimed linen fibre, beaten down and pressed flat. The colour of what she wears tells its own story too, one most people never think to ask about. Alison's everyday dress is a dull, undyed brown, close to the natural colour of the wool itself, because good dye, particularly anything bright or lasting, is costly, sometimes wildly so, and reserved by both expense and, in some times and places, by actual law, for those of higher standing. Certain vivid dyes, deep reds pulled from crushed insects imported from far away, brilliant blues extracted through a laborious fermenting process from a plant called woad, are simply beyond the reach of a household like this one, and even if the money somehow existed, sumptuary laws in various periods and places explicitly forbade people of her station from wearing certain colours and certain fabrics at all, reserving them by statute for nobility. Clothing, in other words, was not simply clothing. It was a visible, walking announcement of exactly where you stood in the world, readable at a glance by anyone who passed you in a lane or at a market, and nobody needed to ask. Outside, a sound rises from further down the lane, sharp and sudden, a squeal quickly cut short, and it is, Marjorie explains without much drama when Ellen asks what it was, simply the neighbour's family slaughtering a pig. This happens, typically once a year, in the cooler months of late autumn, timed carefully so the meat can be preserved through the coming winter without spoiling in warmth, and it is treated in this world not as something hidden away or squeamish, but as a genuinely significant household event, almost communal in nature, since neighbours often help each other through it in turn, moving from house to house across a week or two as each family takes its turn. Almost nothing of the animal goes unused. The meat is salted, smoked over the hearth fire, packed into barrels. The fat is rendered down into lard that will see the household through months of cooking. Even the bladder finds a use, cleaned and dried and turned, sometimes, into a crude ball for children to kick around a lane, which is very possibly closer to the true ancestor of Watt's rag-stuffed ball than anyone in this house would think to mention. As the afternoon wears on, Cecily begins talking, mostly to herself and mostly about the calendar, counting off days toward a coming feast, because the entire shape of this family's year, unlike yours, is not organised around months and dates on a wall calendar, but around the church's own rhythm of saints' days and holy observances, layered over the older agricultural rhythm of planting and harvest that came before the church arrived at all, and never entirely left. Michaelmas has passed not long ago, the feast marking the Archangel, and with it, in many villages, a particular custom involving a roasted goose that Alison cannot quite afford this year, though she mentions it anyway, a small wistful note in an otherwise practical conversation. Martinmas is coming, in November, another marker tied closely to that same annual slaughter of livestock too costly to feed through winter, and behind that, further off, the longer stretch of Advent, and then, eventually, the 12 full days of Christmas itself, which in this era stretches out far longer and looser than the single tidy day you know, running from Christmas through into January, full of its own smaller customs, its own feasting where feasting can be afforded, its own quiet, meaningful pause in the endless cycle of labour. There is a coming feast day nearer at hand too, a local one, tied to the particular saint their own small parish church is dedicated to. And this is the kind of thing that would matter enormously to a family like this one, and appear nowhere at all in any grand history of the era, because it belonged entirely to this village, this small patch of England, this particular church built by people whose names nobody now remembers. On that day, work mostly stops. There will be a procession from the church, the villagers walking together behind a carried image of the saint, and afterward, out on the green, there will be wrestling matches between the young men, and archery, since every able man in the kingdom is required by long-standing law to practice archery regularly, a requirement that exists for reasons of national defence, but that quietly doubles, on days like this, as genuine entertainment and genuine pride. There will be dancing too, simple circle dances to a single piper's tune, and Marjorie has already, more than once this week, mentioned it to her mother, with the particular restrained excitement of a child trying very hard not to seem too eager about something she cares about a great deal. It is on days like this, feast days, that courtship of a sort happens too, in ways that are far more supervised and far more communal than anything you would recognise from later centuries of private courting. A young man does not simply approach a young woman alone. He is watched by her family, by half the village really, and any real interest tends to be expressed through small, coded, almost ritualized gestures, a particular flower given, a particular place chosen to stand during a dance, and everyone present understands exactly what is being said without a single explicit word passing between the two people most concerned. Marriage itself, for a family at this level of society, tends to happen relatively young by later standards, though not nearly as young as popular imagination sometimes suggests, and it carries with it an entirely practical dimension that sits alongside whatever affection exists, since a marriage joins two households' resources, two families' labour, in a way that matters enormously to the survival of both. Ellen has wandered toward the doorway now, small and unhurried, where a thin cat sits sunning itself in the pale afternoon light, and she reaches down to stroke it with the easy, unthinking affection of a small child toward any warm and willing creature. This cat is not a pet in the sense you would use the word, not exactly, though there is genuine fondness for it in this household, real enough that Ellen has given it a name nobody else quite remembers to use. It earns its place here primarily by keeping the grain store free of mice, a task with real economic weight behind it, since rodents getting into stored grain over winter could mean actual hunger by spring. And yet, alongside that practical function, something softer clearly exists too, visible in the way Cecily sometimes saves a scrap of fat from the pottage and sets it down without comment near the hearth, in the way the cat is allowed, unlike the pig or the chickens, to simply exist in the house without any expectation attached beyond its usual quiet patrol. Dogs occupy a similar dual space, useful for herding, for guarding, for hunting when a household can manage it, and loved anyway, genuinely, in ways that show up again and again in the wills and letters that survive from this era. Small provisions made for a favourite hound's care after its owner's death, the kind of detail that collapses the distance between this world and yours in a single unexpected instant. The afternoon light is beginning, very slowly, to shift, the particular gold slant of it lengthening across the packed earth floor, and there is a lull in the household now, the kind that settles into most working days somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, tasks continuing but at a slightly slower pace, conversation growing a little quieter. Alison has moved from spinning to mending, a shirt of Watt's torn at the shoulder from some scramble or another, and she works the needle by the light from the doorway rather than risk her eyes in the dimmer interior, because eyesight, once damaged by years of close work in poor light, has no real remedy available to her, no correction, no way back, and every woman in this village who spins and sews and mends for a living understands this without needing to be told. There is a knock at the doorframe, more announcement than request, since the door itself stands open through most of the daylight hours, and it is a neighbour, a widow named Joan, who lives 2 houses along, come to borrow a measure of flour against what she will return after her own next baking. This kind of borrowing, small, frequent, entirely unremarkable, forms an invisible web across the whole village, a running ledger of favours and debts that nobody writes down anywhere because nobody needs to, because the memory of who owes whom what lives instead in the accumulated goodwill and quiet reputation of an entire community that has lived pressed close together. Generation after generation, in the same small cluster of houses, Joan stays a few minutes longer than the transaction strictly requires, trading news, a little gossip about a betrothal being arranged 3 houses over, a complaint about the state of the lane after last week's rain, and this too is part of the actual function of these small daily errands, an excuse disguised as necessity for the kind of ordinary human connection that keeps a hard life bearable. Further along the lane, past Joan's house and the small green where the wrestling matches will happen on feast day, there is a low stone building that draws Marjorie's attention whenever she passes it, because it belongs to a trade entirely separate from farming, one that fascinates her in the particular way any child is fascinated by a craft they do not fully understand. It is the smithy, and the man who works there, a broad-shouldered figure named Osbert, occupies a strange and specific place in village life that is worth pausing on. Smiths, across medieval Europe, carried a reputation that sat somewhere between ordinary tradesmen and something faintly mysterious, almost magical, an association that reached back centuries before this particular village existed at all, rooted in the simple, genuinely astonishing fact that a smith could take a lump of dull grey ore or a broken and useless piece of iron, and through fire and hammer and skill nobody else in the village possessed, transform it into something sharp, something useful, something that could plough a field or defend a home. That transformation, watched by people who had no scientific framework at all for understanding heat and metallurgy, looked, to more than a few of them, uncomfortably close to sorcery, and folk stories about smiths making deals with strange forces, about the devil himself once losing a bargain to a clever smith, circulated widely enough that traces of them survive in folklore collected centuries later. Osbert is not, of course, a sorcerer, whatever the old stories imply. He is simply extraordinarily skilled at a genuinely difficult craft, one that took him years of apprenticeship to learn properly, starting as a boy barely older than Watt is now, bound to a master smith for a term of years, during which he received no wages at all beyond food, shelter, and the training itself, an arrangement that would strike you as astonishingly harsh if you did not understand how central it was to how every skilled trade in this world passed itself down. There was no other way to learn. No school taught smithing. No book, even if Osbert could read one, could teach a hand the precise feel of iron at exactly the right heat, softened enough to shape but not yet ruined. That knowledge lived only in the body of someone who already had it, transferred slowly, through years of watching and failing and trying again, from one pair of hands to another. The forge fire itself never fully goes out either, much like the hearth fire back at Adam's house, though for entirely different reasons. Osbert needs it hot and ready at a moment's notice, and building a forge fire from nothing each morning would cost him hours he cannot spare, so it burns low overnight under careful banking, exactly as Alison's does, tended by whichever apprentice currently lives under Osbert's roof, and there is something almost pleasing in realizing that this single practice, keeping a coal alive through darkness, runs underneath the whole village at once, in every hearth and every forge, an entire community quietly united each night in the same small, careful act of preservation. Back in the fields, Adam has paused the ploughing to look at the sky, a habit so automatic he barely notices himself doing it anymore, reading the particular quality of the clouds building slowly along the western horizon the way you might glance at a phone screen to check the forecast, except that everything he knows comes from decades of accumulated observation rather than any instrument. A ring around the moon the night before, which he mentioned briefly at breakfast, is taken, in the weather lore of the countryside, as a sign of rain to come within a few days, and whether or not there is any real meteorological truth buried inside that particular piece of folk wisdom, and there is, as it happens, a loose scientific basis in the ice crystals that create such a ring, often preceding a change in weather systems, Adam trusts it completely, because it has been right often enough across his lifetime to earn that trust honestly, the same way any of us trust a pattern we have watched hold true again and again. Weather, in a world with no way to store food across a genuinely bad year beyond what could be preserved by salt and smoke and careful management, was never simply a matter of comfort. a late frost at the wrong moment in spring, a wet harvest season that rotted grain in the field before it could be brought in, could mean real hunger stretching across an entire village through the following winter, sometimes real death among the oldest and youngest, the ones with the least reserve to draw on. This is part of why so much folk belief clusters so densely around weather and harvest, why certain saints are prayed to specifically for good weather at planting time, why processions are sometimes made around the boundaries of a field in spring asking for blessing on the coming crop, a custom called beating the bounds in some regions that combined practical land surveying, since walking the parish boundary each year kept its exact edges fresh in communal memory, with genuine religious hope for protection and abundance. Watt, working beside his father, asks at one point why they do not simply plough the whole field the same direction every single year, a reasonable child's question, and Adam's answer, given without much thought because the knowledge is so deeply embedded it barely feels like knowledge at all anymore, touches on something the land itself teaches a farmer over enough seasons, how the same furrow worn the same direction year after year can erode a slope, can pool water wrong, can exhaust one part of the soil while leaving another part underused. There is no book behind this answer. There is only Adam's father and his father before him, and generations of small adjustments made in response to bad years and good ones, distilled down into a set of habits that look, from Watt's position beside the plough, like simple unquestionable fact, the way the sun rising each morning looks like simple unquestionable fact, though of course it rests on centuries of hard-won observation underneath. The light has shifted further now, the gold gone slightly amber, the particular hour when the day's heat, such as it was, begins to loosen its hold on the air. And back at the house, Alison has begun preparing for supper, lighter than the midday meal as always, likely bread again, perhaps a little cheese if there is any left from what she traded for at market. And while she works, her mind moves, as it often does at this hour, toward the small ongoing worry that sits underneath most of her days, without ever quite rising to the surface in conversation. It is autumn now, the season turning, and what this family has stored, what they have salted and dried and set aside in the small chest and the covered jars along the wall, needs to carry 5 people, 6 counting Cecily, through a winter that could run either mild or brutal, and there is no way to know in advance which kind it will be. This quiet arithmetic, food against months, sits behind nearly every decision made in a household like this one at this time of year, whether to slaughter the older hen now, or risk feeding her a while longer for the chance of a few more eggs, whether to trade away a portion of the stored grain for something else needed now, or hold it back against a worse month later. It is not dramatic worry, not the kind that shows on a face. It is simply the quiet, constant background math of survival, run silently behind ordinary conversation about the weather and the neighbours and whether Marjorie's dress needs letting out again before winter. There is a particular smell that has settled into the house by this hour, layered and specific in a way no single modern room quite replicates. Wood smoke first and most obviously, but underneath it, the warm animal smell drifting faintly from the partition section where the goats spend their nights, and under that again, something green and slightly sweet from the herbs hanging near the hearth, and threaded through all of it, the particular mineral smell of the packed earth floor itself, swept but never fully clean, in the way a modern floor is clean, carrying in its very substance the accumulated trace of every meal cooked and every foot that has crossed it for years. It is not an unpleasant smell, not to the people who live inside it every day. It simply is the smell of home, exactly as the specific smell of your own house, whatever it happens to be, would strike a stranger as distinctive in a way you yourself have long since stopped noticing. Adam and Watt return as the light truly begins to fail, both of them carrying the particular tiredness of a full day's physical labour, the kind that settles into the shoulders and the lower back and asks for nothing more complicated than food and rest. Before either of them sits, though, there is a small ritual that happens at the threshold itself, one so automatic that neither of them would think to describe it as a ritual at all. They wipe their boots, as best the boots can be wiped, on a scraping stone set into the ground just outside the door, because the packed earth floor inside, while far from pristine, is at least kept clear of the worst of the field's mud, a small daily negotiation between the world outside and the world within that exists in some form in nearly every household across the village. Supper is quiet compared to the midday meal, bread, a little cheese, the last of the pottage from the pot that has now been simmering in one form or another for the better part of 3 days. Nobody complains about the repetition. Repetition, in food as in nearly everything else in this life, is simply the water they swim in, expected, unremarkable, entirely different from the constant novelty you might expect from a meal today. And yet there is real pleasure at this table tonight anyway, small and specific, because Cecily has managed to trade for a handful of dried apple slices from a neighbour earlier in the week, saved carefully, and she produces them now, dividing them with obvious ceremony among the 3 children, a treat rare enough that Ellen's whole face changes at the sight of it, the kind of pure, uncomplicated delight that a child can find in something so small it would barely register to an adult in your own century, surrounded by abundance. After supper, as the fire is built up a little for the evening, and the last of the daylight fully gives way outside, the household settles into what is, in many ways, the most cherished part of the entire day, the hour or so before full sleep, when there is nothing left to do but sit close to the fire and talk. This is when Cecily tells stories, and she has told most of them so many times that the children could recite portions alongside her, and yet they never seem to tire of hearing them again, the way a child today will ask for the exact same book at bedtime for the 100th night running. Tonight it is a story about a fox who outwits a much larger and much crueler wolf through sheer cleverness rather than strength. An old story, its bones recognizable in fables that reach back through the entire span of medieval literature and further still, and Cecily tells it with small variations each time, a different detail added or dropped depending on her mood, so that even a story the children know by heart never comes out quite the same way twice. There are other kinds of stories too, told less often, reserved for particular moods or particular nights. Stories about the strange creatures believed to live at the edges of the known world, in the deep forest beyond the last cultivated field, or in the water of the old mill pond after dark. Cecily is careful with these, aware, in the way that grandmothers across every century seem instinctively aware, of exactly how much fright a child can hold before it tips over from delicious shiver into genuine bad dream. And tonight, sensing Ellen's tiredness, she keeps to gentler material, a riddle instead, one that Watt gets half right before Marjorie finishes it for him, both of them laughing at something that would strike you, hearing it now, as almost impossibly simple, and yet it fills this small firelit room with exactly the kind of warmth that makes an entire hard day feel, in retrospect, worth having lived. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into the room once the story is finished, the kind where nobody says much of anything for a while, and it is into this quiet that Adam mentions, almost as an afterthought, that the reeve came by the field that afternoon, and this single small piece of news carries more weight in this household than its brief mention might suggest. The reeve is a figure worth understanding, because he occupies a position that has no very neat modern equivalent, a man chosen, often by the villagers themselves, though sometimes appointed by the Lord's steward, to act as a kind of working manager for the manor's daily agricultural business, organising shared labour, settling minor disputes over land boundaries and grazing rights, making sure the Lord received the portion of produce and labour owed to him under the complicated web of obligations that bound a family like Adam's to the land they worked. Adam does not own the strips of land he ploughs. He holds them in a legal arrangement that would take some explaining to fully untangle, in exchange for a set number of days each year spent labouring on the Lord's own domain of land, the portion kept directly for the Lord's household, alongside certain payments in produce and, on occasion, in coin. This arrangement, villenage in its various regional forms, sat at the very centre of how the entire agricultural world functioned, and it is neither slavery exactly, nor freedom exactly, but something specific to this century that resists easy translation into modern categories. Adam cannot simply leave this land and move elsewhere without permission, cannot marry off a daughter without, technically, a payment owed to the Lord for the privilege, cannot grind his own grain at a hand mill at home, but must instead pay to use the Lord's mill, a requirement enforced closely enough that hidden hand querns, small hand-operated grinding stones, occasionally get discovered and confiscated by the Lord's officials when a family tries to save the milling fee by grinding secretly at home. And yet within all these binding obligations, there is also a kind of stability that should not be dismissed too quickly. The land, in practice, tends to pass down within families across generations, held customarily even without full legal ownership, and the Lord, whatever else he might be, has his own strong practical interest in his tenants surviving a bad winter, since a dead tenant produces no labour and no rent the following year. Cecily remembers, and mentions sometimes on quieter evenings like this one, the years just after the great sickness swept through the region when she herself was a young woman, the plague that had taken so many across the whole country that labour itself, ordinary working hands, suddenly became scarce and valuable in a way nobody living had ever seen before. Lords who had always had more workers than land needed suddenly found themselves desperate to keep the workers who remained, and for a brief window, remembered now mostly by the very old, wages rose and some of the old obligations loosened before new laws were passed trying, not entirely successfully, to force everything back to how it had been. It is one of the few moments where Cecily's stories brush directly against the larger sweep of history you might read about in a book, and even then, she tells it the way she tells everything, as something that happened to people, to neighbours, to her own mother's generation, rather than as a date or a fact to be memorized. The children are settling now, Ellen already drooping against her grandmother's side, and Alison moves to bank tomorrow's fire in the same careful way she coaxed it awake this morning, ash pulled gently over the glowing coals, not to kill the fire but to slow it, to let it rest through the dark hours, the same way the household itself is about to rest. Before anyone actually lies down, though, there is a brief quiet prayer, said together, mostly by memory, a habit so deeply worn into the rhythm of the evening that even Ellen, barely able to keep her eyes open, murmurs along with the shape of the words, if not always their precise meaning. It is not a long prayer. It asks, in essence, for safekeeping through the night, for protection against the dangers that a world without light after dark genuinely does hold, dangers that feel abstract to you now with your porch lights and your locked doors and your phone glowing on the nightstand, but that felt entirely real to this family, for whom true darkness, absolute and total, descends completely once that fire is banked and no candle remains lit. And here is something I think you will find genuinely fascinating, something that quietly reshapes how you might think about your own sleep tonight. This family, and most families like them across medieval Europe, did not sleep the way you do, in one long unbroken stretch from night until morning. They slept in two distinct segments, a first sleep beginning not long after full dark, lasting perhaps 4 hours, and then a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, sometimes an hour or more, before a second sleep carried them through until dawn. This was not insomnia. It was not considered strange or troubling in any way. It was simply how a night was understood to be structured, so thoroughly ordinary that historians only really rediscovered the practice by combing carefully through old letters, court records and medical texts that mention, almost in passing, activities happening in what they casually called the watch between sleeps. People used this middle waking period for all sorts of quiet things. Prayer, often, since the hour was considered particularly suited to it. Quiet conversation between a husband and wife, the kind of unhurried talk that daylight hours, filled with labour and children and neighbours, rarely allowed for. Sometimes small tasks, tending the fire, checking on a restless child. Sometimes simply lying awake in the dark, thinking, the mind moving in that particular unhurried way that only comes in the deep quiet middle of the night, with no obligation pressing on it. It makes me wonder, honestly, whether something in us still remembers this rhythm, somewhere underneath centuries of electric light and rigid single blocks of sleep. If you have ever woken in the small hours of the night for no clear reason, lain there for a while in a strange, calm, unbothered wakefulness before drifting back under again, you have perhaps brushed up against something very old, something your body may still carry even though the world around it changed entirely long ago. There is no need to fight that wakefulness should it visit you tonight. Cecily never once did. She simply let it happen, let her mind wander through the banked dark, and trusted, the way this whole family trusts every single night, that sleep would return on its own when it was ready. Dreams themselves carried real weight in this world, taken far more seriously as sources of meaning than most people today would ever think to take them. A bad dream was not simply dismissed as random mental noise, the way you might wave one off over morning coffee. It might be discussed the next day, turned over, interpreted, sometimes against a set of traditional associations passed down much like Cecily's herb knowledge, certain animals or certain colours appearing in a dream, carrying particular significance, certain kinds of dreams considered genuine warnings worth heeding, others dismissed as nothing more than the body's own restlessness, brought on by a heavy supper or an overtired mind. There were even small books circulating among those who could read, dream keys they were sometimes called, offering interpretations for common dream images, evidence of just how widespread and how seriously held this whole framework of meaning really was, stretching from grand cathedral cities all the way down to a small firelit room like this one, where Cecily, unable to read a single word of any such book, nonetheless carries an oral version of much the same tradition entirely in memory. Outside, full dark has fallen now, and the particular silence of a medieval night settles over the whole village, a silence almost unimaginable to you, accustomed as you likely are to the low electrical hum, the distant traffic, the countless small mechanical sounds that fill even a quiet night in your own world without you ever quite noticing them as sound at all. Here there is none of that. There is wind when it moves, in the thatch overhead, a soft continuous shifting rustle. There is, occasionally, an owl somewhere out past the fields, a sound that carries a genuine weight of superstition in this era, an owl's cry near a house, sometimes taken as an omen worth remarking on, though not always a bad one, depending on which owl and which direction it called from. A whole small folk taxonomy of meaning, built around a sound you would likely sleep straight through without noticing at all. The moon, when it is up and unclouded, provides genuinely useful light, more useful than you might assume, enough for Adam to have crossed the yard earlier without a torch, enough that travel by moonlight, while never entirely safe, was common enough that people planned journeys around it, timing a departure from one village to another for the nights nearest the full moon specifically, so as to have that extra margin of visibility on the road. This single practical fact, the moon as a genuine and necessary source of working light, shaped travel patterns, work patterns, even certain court dates and market days across the medieval world in ways that have almost entirely vanished from a modern life lit, regardless of the moon's phase, exactly the same every single night. The seasons turn. In a village like this one, with a rhythm so pronounced and so thoroughly woven into daily life that it is worth following the year forward a little further, past this one particular autumn evening, to see how differently this same family's days will look only a few months from now. Winter, once it fully arrives, changes almost everything about how the household spends its hours, because so much of the outdoor labour that structures spring, summer and autumn simply becomes impossible, or at least far more limited, once the fields lie frozen and the light shrinks down to only a handful of usable hours each day. Adam's work shifts toward maintenance, mending tools, repairing the wattle fencing that keeps livestock contained, threshing the grain that was brought in during autumn but not yet fully processed, work that can be done under a roof, by firelight if needed, away from the worst of the cold. Indoor work expands to fill the space that outdoor work leaves behind, and this is really Alison's season in a household like this one, the months where spinning and weaving and mending take up an even larger share of every day, since there is little else to occupy the daylight hours besides tending the fire and keeping everyone fed on stores laid in months earlier. It is, in a strange way, a quieter time and a more dangerous one all at once. Quieter because the frantic pace of planting and harvest eases off entirely, dangerous because everything now depends on whether those earlier months of careful storage were enough, whether the salted meat holds, whether the grain lasts, whether illness, which spreads more easily in a household pressed close together for warmth through the coldest weeks, manages to pass this particular family by. Christmas itself, when it arrives, brings a genuine and welcome break in the grinding rhythm of work, and it looks in its shape and its length almost nothing like the single day you know. The full stretch runs, by long tradition, from Christmas Day itself through to Epiphany nearly 2 weeks later, and across those days ordinary labour mostly stops, replaced by feasting where feasting can be managed, by games, by visiting between households that spend most of the rest of the year fully absorbed in their own separate work. There is a tradition, in villages like this one, of choosing a lord of misrule for part of this period, someone, often quite low in the ordinary social order, a servant or a young unmarried man, temporarily granted a kind of playful mock authority over the festivities, allowed to call for games, to order small harmless tasks of the assembled company, an inversion of the everyday hierarchy that everyone understood, even as it happened, to be entirely temporary, a pressure valve built directly into the calendar, releasing for a handful of days each year some of the accumulated weight of a social order that otherwise held remarkably firm for the other 350 days. Plough Monday follows not long after. The traditional day work in the fields resumes, and it carries its own small custom worth knowing. Young men from the village sometimes dragging a decorated plough from house to house, asking for small gifts of food or coin, a half-serious, half-playful ritual marking the genuine return of labour after the break, equal parts practical announcement and communal celebration, the kind of custom that would look, to a modern observer, almost like a parade, if a parade could also double as a subtle economic transaction between neighbours who will be relying on each other's goodwill for the entire working year that follows. Spring, when it finally arrives after the long stretch of winter, brings its own cluster of customs, and among them, May Day stands out as one of the most widely loved across the whole of the English countryside, a genuine, unguarded celebration of the return of warmth and growing light after months of cold and short days. Villagers rise early, before dawn in many places, to go out into the woods and gather fresh green branches and flowers, bringing them back to decorate doorways and the church itself, and there is dancing around a decorated pole in the village green, music from whatever instruments the village can muster, a pipe, a small drum, sometimes a fiddle if a travelling musician happens to be passing through at just the right moment. Marjorie has attended this every year of her life she can remember, and this coming spring, for the first time, she will be old enough to properly join the dancing herself, rather than simply watching from the edge with the younger children, a small but genuinely significant milestone in a life that does not mark birthdays with any particular ceremony, since exact ages, oddly enough, matter far less here than they do to you, tracked loosely if at all, beyond a general sense of how many summers a person has seen. There is also, scattered through the warmer months, the possibility of a pilgrimage, and while a family like Adams could rarely manage anything so grand as a journey all the way to Canterbury, or further still, to a shrine across the sea, smaller local pilgrimages, to a nearby holy well, or a parish famous for housing a particular relic, a fragment of bone or cloth associated with a saint, were well within reach and genuinely common. These journeys served several purposes all at once, in a way that would strike you as remarkably practical once you see it laid out. They were acts of devotion, genuinely and sincerely meant, undertaken sometimes in thanks for a recovery from illness, sometimes in hope of one, but they were also, quite plainly, holidays, in something close to the modern sense of the word, a rare sanctioned break from ordinary labour, an excuse to travel, to see a part of the country otherwise never glimpsed, to meet other pilgrims on the road and trade stories the whole way there and back. Chaucer, writing not so very far from this family's own lifetime, understood this perfectly well, which is exactly why his own pilgrims spend so much of their famous journey doing precisely what any real group of medieval travellers would do, talking, joking, competing to tell the best story, treating a solemn religious obligation and a genuinely enjoyable trip as two things that could comfortably exist inside the very same journey. Bread, which we touched on earlier this evening as something eaten off of, rather than merely alongside, carries one more small oddity worth knowing, tied to how it actually gets baked in a village like this one. Adam's family, like most households of their station, does not own an oven. Building and firing a proper baking oven, one capable of holding heat evenly enough to bake bread rather than simply char it, requires both resources and skill beyond what a single small household typically commands, And so, much like the milling of grain, baking is often centralized, sometimes at a communal oven maintained by the village itself, sometimes, in places where the Lord held tighter control over such things, at an oven the Lord owned and charged a fee to use, exactly as with the mill. Alison prepares her dough at home, shapes it, marks it in some households with a small distinguishing cut or stamp so it can be told apart from a dozen other loaves baking in the same oven at once, and carries it to be baked on set days, timed carefully around when the communal oven's fire has been properly built up. It is again one of those small logistical realities that never makes it into the grand sweeping histories, and yet it shaped an entire regular rhythm of errands and timing across every single week of this family's life. Weddings, when they happen in this village, unfold with a particular blend of church ceremony and genuinely raucous community celebration that would surprise anyone picturing something purely solemn. The actual legal and religious core of the marriage, interestingly, did not always require a priest at all in the earliest parts of this era, since a couple's mutual consent, spoken aloud to each other, was for a long stretch considered sufficient to constitute a valid marriage under church law, though by the time of this particular story, the church had worked hard to bring the ceremony firmly inside its own doors, publishing bans, the public announcement of an intended marriage, on 3 separate Sundays beforehand specifically, so that anyone with a reason the marriage should not proceed, a prior betrothal, a forbidden degree of relation, had the chance to speak up before the vows were made final. The wedding itself, once it happens, often takes place not deep inside the church, but at the church door, in view of the gathered community, before the couple moves inside for a mass, and afterward comes the part that everyone actually most looks forward to: food, drink, music, dancing that can run long into the evening, a genuine outpouring of communal joy that a village starved for regular festivity seizes with real enthusiasm whenever the occasion allows. A dowry, in a family like Adam's, would not resemble the vast fortunes exchanged in noble marriages, the kind you might read about in stories of great estates and political alliances. It might be a small sum of coin carefully saved over years, or, just as often, goods, a cow, a set of household linens, tools useful to a new household just beginning, whatever a family could manage to set aside for a daughter's eventual marriage, and the negotiation over exactly what would be provided, conducted between the two fathers involved, was taken with genuine seriousness, since it shaped the practical foundation on which an entirely new household, and eventually an entirely new family, would be built. Naming a child, in this world, happened almost immediately after birth rather than being drawn out over days or weeks the way it sometimes is now, and the reason behind the speed is one of those details that quietly reveals how differently infancy itself was understood and experienced here. Infant mortality in the first days and weeks of life ran high enough, by causes ranging from difficult births to illnesses with no available treatment, that baptism was often arranged as quickly as possible, sometimes within a single day of birth, because church teaching held that an unbaptized soul faced genuine spiritual risk, and no family wanted to leave a newborn even briefly outside the church's protection if it could possibly be avoided. Godparents, chosen carefully, took on a role considerably weightier than the largely ceremonial one the word suggests today, a real and lasting obligation to help raise the child in the faith, and often, practically speaking, a real social and sometimes financial safety net should anything happen to the child's own parents. Ellen has 2 godparents of her own, a neighbouring couple who take their role seriously enough that they still, 4 years on, bring her a small gift each year on the feast day of the saint she was named for, a quiet ongoing thread of connection that has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with a promise made over a font when she was only hours old. Names themselves, when you look closely at the pattern across a village like this one, cluster heavily around a fairly small pool of options: biblical names, names of popular saints, a handful of older names carried over from generations before the Normans arrived and reshaped so much of the country's language and custom. This is part of why nicknames and specific bynames tied to occupation or appearance or place of origin mattered so much practically, since a village might easily contain 3 or 4 men named John or William, and some further distinguishing mark became necessary simply to know, in ordinary conversation, which particular John anyone actually meant. Adam's own surname, Fletcher, tied to arrow making, likely began this way generations back, a practical distinguishing label that eventually hardened over enough repetitions and enough generations into something fixed and inherited rather than merely descriptive. Formal education, in the sense of a schoolroom and a curriculum, touches this family's life barely at all, and this too is worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over. Marjorie and Watt will very likely never learn to read in any formal sense, not because anyone considers this a tragedy exactly, but because literacy in this world serves a fairly narrow and specific set of purposes, mostly clerical, mostly connected to the church or to the management of estates and legal records, purposes that simply do not touch the daily working life of a family who farms strips of land and spins wool and mends fences for a living. What they learn instead is enormous in its own right, simply uncategorized by anything resembling a school. Watt is learning, this very autumn, the entire practical science of ploughing and crop rotation and animal husbandry, absorbed through years of watching and doing beside his father. Marjorie is learning herbal medicine from Cecily, spinning and weaving from Alison, the entire practical management of a household that she will, within a decade or so, be expected to run largely on her own once she marries. It is not the education you would recognize. It is, within its own context, a complete one. Harvest time, several weeks behind this particular autumn evening if you count backward through the calendar, stands as easily the most intense and most important stretch of the entire working year, and Lammas, the first day of August, marks its traditional beginning, a feast whose very name comes from an old phrase meaning loaf mass, tied to the custom of bringing bread baked from the very first ripe grain of the new harvest to church to be blessed. Everything else in the household's rhythm bends around harvest once it begins. Even Ellen, small as she is, has a role, following behind the older workers to gather any stray grain missed in the main cutting, a practice called gleaning that carries real economic weight beneath its simple appearance, since by long-standing custom across much of the English countryside, whatever grain remained scattered in a field after the main harvest belonged, by right, to the poorest members of the community who came to gather it, a small deliberately built-in mechanism of communal support woven directly into the agricultural calendar itself rather than treated as separate charity. The whole village works the harvest together in a way that little else in the yearly rhythm quite matches, since the window for bringing in grain safely, before weather turns and ruins it standing in the field, is narrow enough that individual households cannot manage it entirely alone. Neighbours move from field to field in turn, exactly as they do for the autumn pig slaughter, cutting with sickles in long-practiced rhythmic strokes, binding the cut stalks into sheaves, stacking the sheaves into shocks that stand drying in the field before being carted finally to wherever they will be threshed and stored. It is exhausting work, dawn to dusk for days running, and yet it carries, alongside the exhaustion, a genuine festive energy too, a harvest home celebration at the very end of it, the last cartload brought in decorated sometimes with ribbons or greenery, a meal provided by the Lord, or by whichever household hosts the gathering, music and dancing capping off weeks of the hardest physical labour the year demands. Wool, meanwhile, sitting quietly in the background of nearly everything this family does, deserves its own moment of attention, because it is genuinely difficult to overstate how central it was to the entire economy of medieval England, not merely to this one household's modest spinning, but to the wealth of the whole kingdom. English wool, prized across the continent for its quality, financed wars, built the enormous churches and monasteries whose ruins and survivors still draw visitors centuries later, and supported an entire complex trading network stretching from small village flocks like the handful of sheep a neighbouring family keeps, all the way to the great trading fairs of Flanders, where English wool was bought, processed, and turned into fine cloth that sold back across Europe at a substantial markup. A single sheep walking placidly through a field just outside this village sits, in other words, at the very bottom of a genuinely vast economic chain that reaches, link by link, all the way up to kings and their treasuries, though the sheep itself and the family who tends it likely never think of it in quite those terms, occupied as they are with the far more immediate concerns of keeping it fed, sheared, and safe from whatever might threaten a flock through a long working year. Once or twice a year, if fortune and finances allow, the family makes a longer trip to the market town, larger and considerably louder than anything the village itself offers, and it is worth walking through it briefly because the contrast tells you something about just how much variation existed within what gets flattened, in most people's imagination, into a single undifferentiated medieval world. The town has proper shops, permanent structures rather than temporary stalls, each craft often clustered together along its own particular street, so that you might walk down one lane thick with the smell and sound of tanning leather, and turn a corner into another given over entirely to bakers, their ovens, unlike the village's single communal one, running almost continuously. Guilds govern much of this activity, organizations of masters within a particular trade who set standards for quality, regulate who may train as an apprentice, and eventually rise to master status themselves, and generally hold a level of organized economic and even political power that a small farming village simply has no equivalent of. There is, in the better appointed towns, something called a bathhouse, sometimes referred to bluntly as a stew, and this detail tends to genuinely surprise people who have absorbed the popular idea that medieval people never washed at all. Public bathhouses, offering hot water bathing in shared tubs, existed and were used, particularly in towns with the infrastructure to support them, though their reputation, it must be said honestly, grew complicated over the centuries, since some establishments operating under the name doubled, more or less openly, as something closer to a brothel, enough that the word stew itself eventually picked up that secondary unsavory association in common speech. Respectable bathhouses did exist too, though, genuinely used for washing, and for the kind of social soaking you might recognize from a modern spa, and the swings in their reputation across different decades and different towns reflect an ongoing tension between genuine hygienic practice and moral anxiety that runs through quite a lot of medieval urban life once you start looking for it. A physician, properly trained at one of the handful of universities offering such study, practices in towns like this one too, serving mostly the wealthier residents who can afford his fees, and his methods, rooted in a theory of the body built around four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, whose balance was believed to govern both physical and even emotional health, would strike you hearing them described plainly as strange in a very particular way, not foolish exactly, but built from an entirely different set of first principles than anything modern medicine would recognize. Bloodletting, drawing blood deliberately from a patient believed to have too much of it relative to the other humours, was a genuinely common treatment for an enormous range of complaints, performed sometimes by physicians and, just as often, by barbers, whose striped pole, still visible outside barbershops centuries later in places that have long forgotten why, originally advertised exactly this particular service alongside haircutting and tooth-pulling, the red representing blood, the white representing the bandages used to bind the wound afterward. Light itself after dark is a resource this family measures far more carefully than you likely ever think to measure the electric light filling your own home each evening, and the difference in cost between different sources of it maps almost exactly onto the difference in social standing between households. Beeswax candles, burning clean, bright, and pleasantly scented, sit at the very top of this small hierarchy of light, expensive enough that they are reserved, in a household like Adam's, for only the most special occasions, if they are ever used at all, since beeswax itself competes for value with the honey the same hives produce, and both carry real worth at market. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, sit a step below, more affordable, more common, but carrying a real drawback too, a smoky, somewhat unpleasant smell as they burn, and a tendency to gutter and sputter that beeswax simply does not share. Most nights in this house, though, when light is needed at all beyond the glow of the hearth itself, the family relies on something humbler still, a rushlight, made by soaking the dried pith of a common rush plant, gathered from the ditches and wet ground near the village, in whatever household fat happens to be available, then dried and held, when lit, in a simple metal clip called a rushlight holder that Adam made himself years ago at Osbert's forge in exchange for a favour owed. A single rushlight burns for perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, dim, uneven, but genuinely useful for the short stretch of light needed to find something in the dark, or finish a small task before full sleep. Most evenings, though, honestly, once full dark falls, this family simply does not bother lighting anything beyond what the hearth already provides. There is little reason to. The work of the day is done, and burning a rushlight for its own sake, simply to have brighter light for no particular task, would strike this household as a genuine and pointless waste of a resource that took real effort to gather and prepare. This is, if you think about it for a moment, almost the exact inverse of how you likely live now, where light after dark is so cheap and so automatic that you barely register flipping a switch as a decision at all, let alone one weighed against cost. Here, darkness after supper is simply the natural, expected, entirely unremarkable state of things, met not with any sense of deprivation, but with the plain acceptance that a day's usable hours have ended, and that sleep, sooner or later, is the sensible next thing to do about it. Footwear, worth a brief mention here too, tells its own quiet story about durability and repair, in a world where nothing gets easily replaced. Adam's boots, and Alison's shoes, and even the smaller pair Watt has nearly outgrown, are made of leather, turn shoes in the particular style common through much of this century, stitched inside out, then turned right side out once complete, soled thin enough that a full day's fieldwork wears through them faster than you would expect, which is exactly why a cobbler's repair work, patching and resoling, rather than replacing outright, forms such a steady and essential part of village economic life. Shoes get handed down exactly as clothing does, Watt's current pair having belonged, not so very long ago, to a cousin 2 years his senior, and there is no embarrassment whatsoever attached to this, only the plain, sensible economy of a world where a functioning object, whatever its history, is worth considerably more than a new one nobody can actually afford. Music, threaded through so much of what we have already touched on tonight, the May Day dancing, the wedding celebrations, the piper at village feasts, deserves its own small moment of attention because the instruments themselves and the way ordinary people encountered them differ substantially from anything grand or formal you might picture. A village like this one rarely has access to anything resembling a trained professional musician on any regular basis, beyond perhaps a single piper who plays for feast days and weddings, largely self-taught, learning by ear from whoever taught him in turn. Simple instruments, a wooden pipe, a small drum, sometimes a set of bagpipes in regions where that tradition ran strong, provide the backbone of most village music making, and singing, entirely unaccompanied, fills in everywhere else. Work songs that match the rhythm of a repetitive task, lullabies passed mother to child exactly as Cecily's stories are passed down, carols in the loosest and oldest sense of that word, meaning simply songs meant for communal dancing rather than anything specifically religious, though plenty of genuinely religious songs exist too, taught informally through repetition at church services that half the congregation could sing along to by heart, long before anyone thought to write the words down for them. Games occupied a surprising amount of adult leisure time too, not merely children's play, and dice in particular held a popular and somewhat contested place in village and town life alike, popular enough that church authorities periodically issued complaints and even formal prohibitions against gambling, particularly among clergy who were technically forbidden from it entirely, complaints that survive in enough repeated iterations across the centuries to suggest, fairly clearly, that nobody paid them very much mind. Adam himself, on feast days at the alehouse that serves the village's stronger drink alongside the weak small ale brewed at home, has been known to play at dice with the other men, small modest stakes, a coin or two, nothing that would trouble the household's finances, purely for the pleasure of the game and the company around it. Chess, interestingly, had also made its way into England by this century, arriving originally from the Islamic world by way of Spain some generations earlier, though it remained largely the province of the wealthy and the educated, a game requiring both leisure time and, frankly, a board and pieces worth owning, both well beyond what a family like Adam's could reasonably justify. Watt has seen a set once, carved from bone, at the manor house when his father was called there on some errand, and he still remembers, more than a year later, the particular fascination of watching two grown men sit in complete silence, moving small carved figures across a checkered board with an intensity that struck him, at the time, as almost funny, though he could not have said exactly why. The manor house itself, glimpsed only occasionally by a family like Adam's, mostly when work or obligation calls one of them there directly, offers a useful point of contrast worth pausing on briefly, if only because it corrects the picture that popular imagination tends to default to whenever the word medieval comes up. It is larger, without question, built partly of stone rather than entirely timber and daub, with a proper hall where the Lord dines and where certain manor business gets formally conducted. But even there, even in a household with genuinely more resources than Adam's, comfort as you would define it remains fairly limited by modern standards. Rooms are cold, heated unevenly by fireplaces that lose most of their warmth up the chimney, draughty despite tapestries hung specifically to cut the worst of the wind coming through gaps in stone walls not yet fitted with glass in every window, only in the finest rooms, with cheaper alternatives like oiled linen or wooden shutters covering the rest. The Lord's own bed, grander by far than anything in Adam's house, still rests, underneath its curtains and fine coverings, on much the same rope and slat frame, requiring much the same periodic tightening that keeps Adam's own far humbler bed from sagging in the middle. Status, in other words, brought considerably more comfort in this world, but it did not buy escape from most of the basic physical realities that shaped everyone's life regardless of rank. The cold, the dark, the constant low-grade effort required simply to keep a household fed, warm and functioning. There is a small pond at the edge of the woods past the last cultivated field that the village children have long called, among themselves, a fairy ring pool, and the belief attached to it, gentle rather than frightening in the way it gets told to a child like Ellen, holds that certain quiet, secluded spots in the landscape belong, in some sense, to beings other than ordinary people, the fair folk, best left undisturbed, and, ideally, occasionally left a small offering, a bit of bread, a splash of milk poured out at the threshold or near a particular old tree as a gesture of respect rather than fear exactly. Cecily still pours a little milk near the old oak at the field's edge most months, a habit she inherited from her own mother without ever fully examining why, and when Watt once asked her directly whether she truly believed the fair folk existed, she gave him an answer that has stuck with him since. Something closer to it costs little to be polite than to any firm declaration of belief one way or the other. There is a kind of wisdom in that answer, I think, whatever you make of fairy folklore itself, a willingness to hold a practice lightly, out of respect for the people who handed it down, without needing to resolve every question it raises. Discipline, in raising children like Marjorie and Watt and Ellen, tends to run firmer by modern standards, plainly enough. Physical correction not being uncommon or considered remarkable when a child needed correcting, but it existed alongside, rather than instead of, the same fundamental affection that shapes any family in any century, the same patience taught through repetition, the same pride taken quietly in a child's growing competence at a task newly mastered. Watt successfully guiding the ox in a straight furrow for the first time earlier this year earned him a rare, warm nod from his father that he still, by his own quiet admission to Marjorie one evening, thinks about more than he would ever say aloud. Beekeeping occupies its own small but genuinely significant and often overlooked place in a village economy like this one, tied closely to that earlier mention of beeswax candles sitting so far above tallow and rushlight in the hierarchy of household light. A neighbouring family keeps several hives at the edge of their garden, skeps woven from coiled straw rather than the wooden-framed hives you might picture today, and the honey they produce serves as one of the very few genuinely sweet things available to anyone in this village at all, since sugar, imported from far away and enormously expensive, exists mostly as a rare luxury for the wealthy, a spice almost more than a food, while honey, gathered locally, sweetens what little needs sweetening in an ordinary household's food, occasionally finds its way into a simple mead brewed for a special occasion, and provides alongside the wax a genuinely valuable trading good that this particular neighbouring family leans on more than most for whatever coin they manage to gather across a year. Bees themselves carried their own thread of folk belief too, a widespread custom across the English countryside called telling the bees, in which any significant household event, a death, a marriage, a birth, was formally announced aloud to the hives, on the belief that bees who were not properly informed might sicken, swarm away, or stop producing honey altogether. a small ritual of respect extended to creatures whose labor the whole household depended on. Foraging fills in gaps in the family's diet across every season in ways that would strike you, hearing them named one after another, as a genuinely impressive working knowledge of the surrounding landscape. Wild garlic in spring, gathered from the damp shaded margins of the woods, mushrooms in autumn, picked with the kind of careful, inherited certainty about which kinds are safe that Cecily also brings to her herb shelf, since a mistake here carries real and serious risk. Berries through summer, blackberries especially, gathered by the children in quantities that Alison then preserves, where sugar or honey can be spared for the purpose, into something that will provide a rare sweet taste through the leaner months ahead. Nuts in early autumn, hazelnuts mostly, gathered and stored dry, a small but meaningful addition to a diet that runs, across most of the year, fairly heavily toward grain in one form or another, bread, pottage, the occasional small beer, supplemented by whatever vegetables the family's own small garden plot produces, cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, the plain sturdy staples that fill out a pottage and require relatively little from soil that also has to support the family's main grain crop out in the shared fields. Headwear, worth a brief mention here too, follows its own particular set of rules that would strike a modern eye as remarkably consistent and remarkably meaningful. Alison, like essentially every married woman in the village, does not go about with her hair uncovered, wearing instead a simple linen head covering, sometimes called a coif, tied or pinned to stay in place through a full day of physical work. This is not simply fashion, it carries real social and, in many contexts, religious weight. Married women covering their hair as a visible marker of their status, distinct from the looser, sometimes uncovered hair still permitted to unmarried girls like Marjorie, who will begin covering her own hair, by custom, only once she marries herself, a small daily habit that will mark, for the rest of her life, from that point forward, her transition from one clearly defined stage of a woman's life into the next. Confession, practiced at least once a year as required by church law, though often more frequently among the genuinely devout, structured a family like this one's relationship with their own conscience in a way that has no very neat modern equivalent. Private, one-on-one conversation with the parish priest, a formal accounting of wrongdoing followed by penance, some assigned task or prayer meant to demonstrate genuine repentance that might range from something as simple as a set number of recited prayers to something more substantial depending on the weight of what had been confessed. Purgatory, the belief in an intermediate state after death, where a soul not bound directly for either heaven or hell could be gradually purified through suffering before eventually reaching paradise, shaped an enormous amount of ordinary religious practice in ways that ripple outward from something as personal as private confession into genuinely public acts, prayers said for the souls of the dead, small sums left in wills specifically to pay for masses to be said on a deceased relative's behalf, since the living were understood to have real power to ease a loved one's passage through purgatory by exactly this kind of ongoing devotional effort on their behalf. Relics drew genuine crowds when a church happened to house one, and even a parish as modest as this one's holds, in a small locked box near the altar, a fragment claimed to be a piece of cloth once touched by a well-regarded local saint from several generations back, brought to the church by a bishop's gift long before Cecily's own grandmother was born, and its presence shapes the identity of this whole small parish in a way that would be easy to underestimate from the outside. Pilgrims occasionally pass through specifically to see it, a handful each year, enough that the church has, more than once, used the small offerings such visitors leave to fund a needed repair to the roof or the bell tower, relics functioning, in other words, not merely as objects of devotion, but as a genuine, if modest, economic asset for a community that has few other sources of outside income at all. A peddler comes through the village every month or two, different from the tinker who visited earlier this same day, carrying a pack of small goods too specialized or too rare for the local market to reliably stock. Needles, ribbon, occasionally a small mirror of polished metal, pins, the kind of modest but genuinely useful items that a household cannot easily produce for itself, and that justify the peddler's whole itinerant way of living, walking a wide circuit between villages, welcomed partly for the goods themselves, and partly, exactly like the tinker, for the news and gossip he carries from every other stop along his route. A walking newspaper in an era with no other reliable way for a small isolated village to learn what is happening even one valley over, let alone in the wider kingdom beyond. There is a piece of ordinary technology sitting quietly behind so much of what makes this family's farming work at all. One so basic it barely registers as technology, that is worth pulling out and looking at directly for a moment, because its story is genuinely more interesting than it has any right to be. The horse collar, the padded rigid harness that sits around a horse's shoulders and allows it to pull a heavy load using the strength of its whole body rather than its throat, arrived in Western Europe only a handful of centuries before this particular autumn evening, spreading gradually from further east, and its effect on agriculture, once it did spread, was genuinely enormous. Before it, harnessing methods borrowed originally from oxen pressed against a horse's windpipe under heavy load, meaning a horse pulling hard could quite literally choke itself, severely limiting how much pulling power you could safely draw from an animal that is, by nature, considerably faster and more efficient than an ox. The proper collar solved this almost entirely, and its slow spread across the centuries that followed quietly reshaped how much land a single family could plough, how fast goods could move along the roads, how far a cart could reasonably travel in a single day. Adam still uses an ox rather than a horse, since oxen remain cheaper to keep and better suited to the particular heavy clay soil of this stretch of country, but the shift toward horsepower was already well underway among wealthier farmers by this point, one of those quiet, unglamorous technical changes that never makes it into a story about kings and battles, and yet genuinely altered how much food an entire country could produce. Illness, when it visits this household, as it inevitably does at some point across any given year, brings Cecily's herb shelf into active use in a way that goes beyond the routine daily tending we touched on earlier. A fever running through one of the children prompts a specific practice sequence, a tea brewed from willow bark, which happens to contain a compound genuinely related to what you know today as aspirin, though nobody in this room has any concept of that chemistry, only generations of observed experience that willow bark tea eases a fever and a headache reliably enough to be worth the bother of preparing it. If the illness runs longer or seems more serious, Cecily might send for the village's other recognized healer, a woman named Isolde, older even than Cecily, whose knowledge runs deeper still, and whose services, unlike a university-trained physician's, cost little beyond whatever small gift or favour a family can manage in return, since Isolde's whole practice operates on the same web of reciprocal obligation that runs underneath so much of this village's economic life. There is real skepticism directed at women like Isolde in certain corners of this era's wider culture, occasional suspicion that shades, in its worst and rarest instances, toward genuinely dangerous accusation. But within this particular village, where she has delivered most of the children currently alive and set more broken bones than anyone can count, she is trusted, relied upon, and genuinely valued, her knowledge treated as exactly what it is, a hard-won, carefully accumulated practical skill passed down and refined across a working lifetime. Let us come back now gently to where we started this evening, to that same small firelit room, because it is there, in Adam and Alison's house, on this particular ordinary autumn night, that I want to leave you for the rest of our time together tonight, settling slowly and completely into the last hour before sleep, the way this whole family is settling into it right now. The story Cecily told earlier has long since finished, and the riddle has been solved, and Ellen is properly asleep now, her small body curled against her grandmother's side, one hand still loosely closed around a fold of the older woman's skirt, the way it has been since she was old enough to reach for it. Marjorie lies nearby, not quite asleep yet, listening to the low murmur of her parents' voices across the room, the particular unhurried cadence of two people who have talked together at the end of every single day for more than a decade, and have long since stopped needing to fill every silence between one sentence and the next. Alison checks the fire one final time, and this closing ritual, though we described its morning counterpart hours ago in this very story, deserves its own slow attention now, because it is, in its own quiet way, the true final act of every single day in this household, the last deliberate thing done before the whole family surrenders to the dark. She rakes the coals carefully toward the center of the hearth, gathering the glowing embers into a compact mound rather than letting them scatter thin across the stone, because a concentrated mass of embers holds its heat through the night far longer than the same embers spread wide would ever manage. Over this careful mound she sifts a layer of ash, not too thick, not too thin, judged entirely by feel and decades of practiced habit rather than any measurement, enough to smother the flame and slow the burn down to something that will smoulder gently through 6 or 7 hours of full darkness, without ever fully dying and without ever flaring dangerously bright either. It is, when you really sit with it, a small daily act of remarkable trust, banking a fire and walking away from it into sleep, trusting a pile of ash and glowing coal not to catch the thatch above or the wooden frame around it, a trust built on generations of practiced care, on knowing exactly how much wood, exactly how much ash, exactly how tight or loose the mound needs to sit. The room grows dim as she finishes, the last visible light reduced now to the faintest orange glow at the very heart of the banked hearth, barely enough to make out shapes rather than details. Adam's shoulder, the curve of Cecily's back, the small mounded shape of Ellen already deep in her first sleep of the night. Nobody speaks much now. There is a settling quality to this last stretch of the evening that does not need words, has never needed words, the particular comfortable silence of people who have shared this same small room, this same nightly ritual, for years enough that every small sound, the shift of straw beneath a shifting body, the soft creak of the rope lattice under the mattress, the low crackle of the settling fire, carries its own familiar, comforting meaning. Adam settles onto the mattress beside his wife, the straw shifting and resettling beneath his weight with a soft, dry rustle that has become, over years of marriage, as familiar and unremarkable to him as his own heartbeat. There is a small custom he still keeps, without really thinking about why anymore, of entering the bed from the right side rather than the left, a habit inherited from his own father, tied to an old and widespread piece of folk belief that held the left side, associated across centuries of European superstition with misfortune and with darker forces generally, as the wrong side to rise from or settle into. You still carry a fragment of this exact belief yourself, whether you know it or not, every single time you describe someone in a foul, unexplainable mood as having gotten up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, a phrase whose plain, throwaway modern use sits directly on top of centuries of genuine, carefully observed household habit about which side of a shared bed a person ought to rise from. Outside, somewhere past the low wall separating the sleeping section from the animals, one of the goats shifts its weight audibly, hooves scraping softly against packed earth, and settles again into its own version of the same nightly stillness settling over the humans just a few feet away. Further off, past the edge of the house entirely, the village itself is falling quiet in layers, one household after another banking its own fire, one voice after another lowering into the particular hush that spreads naturally across any small community once true darkness has fully arrived, and there is nothing left, practically speaking, for anyone to be awake and doing. In the larger market town 2 days' travel from here, this same hour would sound rather different, worth knowing if only for the contrast. Many towns of any real size maintain something close to an organized night watch, men walking a set circuit through the streets after dark, calling out the hour at intervals, checking that gates were properly closed, watching for fire, which spread with terrifying speed through streets crowded with closely packed timber buildings, and represented, in truth, one of the single greatest dangers any medieval town faced, far more immediate and far more common than anything resembling the dramatic sieges and battles that dominate popular imagination of the era. A cry of fire in the night, here in the village, would summon every able-bodied person from their beds within minutes, buckets passed hand to hand from the well in a desperate human chain, and it is one of the quiet, unspoken anxieties that sits, so faint it barely registers as anxiety at all, beneath even a carefully banked hearth like the one Alison tends every single night of her life, the awareness, never quite fully set aside, of exactly how much depends on doing this one small careful thing correctly. Tonight, though, there is no such worry troubling this particular house. The fire is banked exactly as it should be. The animals are settled, the children sleep, and Adam, lying beside his wife in the near total dark, feels the particular heaviness moving through his own limbs that a full day of honest physical labour earns, a tiredness that asks for nothing more complicated than surrender, and gives it, within a few minutes, without a struggle. Alison lies awake a few minutes longer than her husband, as she often does, her mind moving in the loose, unhurried way minds tend to move in the last stretch before sleep finally claims them, touching lightly on tomorrow, on whether the bread will rise properly given the coolness that has settled into the air these past few days, on whether she ought to ask Joan tomorrow whether her own hens have started laying again after their autumn slowdown, on nothing very urgent at all really, just the soft accumulated residue of an ordinary day settling itself before sleep can fully arrive. She thinks briefly of her own mother, gone some years now, and of a particular phrase her mother used to say at exactly this hour, tucking a much younger Alison into a bed very like this one in a house not far from where she lies now. A phrase about the fire keeping watch so the family need not, and she finds herself, without quite deciding to, murmuring some close variation of it now, half aloud, half only in her own head, a small unbroken thread of memory stretching back through her mother, and presumably through whoever taught her mother the same words in turn. This is, I think, one of the quiet threads worth sitting with tonight, this idea of a phrase, a gesture, a small nightly habit, passed down so many times across so many generations that nobody left alive could tell you exactly where it began, only that it has always been there, waiting at the end of every ordinary day, ready to be picked up again exactly where the last person set it down. Alison does not know, could not possibly know, that centuries from now a version of her nightly fire ritual will have given its very name to the concept of a curfew, that a phrase about which side of the bed to rise from will still be casually used by people living lives she could not begin to imagine. She only knows the fire is banked, the children are safe, and sleep, finally, gently, is arriving. Marjorie, still not quite asleep, listens to her parents breathing slow and deepen beside her in the dark, and to Watt's occasional soft shifting on his other side, and finds herself thinking, in the drowsy half-formed way an 11-year-old's thoughts tend to wander at this hour, about the coming feast day, about whether she will be brave enough to actually join the dancing this year rather than simply watching from the edge as she always has before, about the particular boy from 2 houses down who has, this past summer, started seeming somehow different to notice than he used to, a small shift in her own attention that she does not yet have any real words for and does not feel any particular need to examine closely. These are, in their own way, entirely ordinary thoughts for a girl her age in any century at all, and there is something quietly moving, I think, in realizing how little that particular texture of drowsy half-formed adolescent thought has actually changed across 800 years, however much everything surrounding it, the house, the bed, the very fabric of daily life, has changed almost beyond recognition. I find myself wondering, sometimes, how we actually know any of this. All these small, precise domestic details about people who left behind no diaries, no letters, nothing resembling the kind of personal written record that lets historians reconstruct a wealthier or more literate life in such vivid detail. The honest answer is that this picture comes together the way a mosaic comes together, from hundreds of small, scattered, unglamorous fragments, rather than any single complete source. Manor Court rolls, the written records kept by a lord's officials tracking disputes, fines, and obligations among tenants, turn out to be a genuinely rich source, because buried inside the dry legal language of who owed what to whom are countless small incidental details about ordinary life, mentioned only because they happened to matter to some dispute or payment being recorded. Wills, even modest ones, list possessions item by item, revealing exactly what a household like this one actually owned, down to individual cooking pots and articles of clothing. Church records track baptisms, marriages, and burials, letting historians reconstruct family structures and life expectancies with real precision, and archaeology fills in enormous amounts more. Excavated house foundations revealing exactly how a longhouse was laid out, discarded shoes and tools, and broken pottery pulled from old rubbish pits and riverbeds, telling us, in astonishing physical detail, what people actually wore, ate from, and worked with, sometimes contradicting what written sources alone would have suggested. Even something as specific as the segmented sleep pattern we talked about earlier tonight, the first sleep and second sleep separated by a quiet waking hour, comes to us this way, pieced together not from any single triumphant discovery, but from historians noticing the same casual, unremarkable phrase, references to the time between sleeps, turning up again and again across medical texts, court depositions, even the plots of stories and poems, mentioned so casually, so entirely without explanation, that its writers clearly assumed every single reader would already understand exactly what was being described, would recognize it instantly from their own ordinary nights, in exactly the way you would not bother explaining to anyone today what it means to hit snooze on an alarm clock. That kind of casual, unexplained reference, appearing again and again across unrelated sources with no one ever feeling the need to define it, is often the strongest evidence historians can hope for that a practice was not remarkable at all, but simply completely unremarkably normal. This is, in a way, the entire spirit behind everything we have walked through together tonight. None of what you have heard, the fire kept alive under ash through the night, the shared bed, the bread doubling as a plate, the animals sharing the very walls of the house, the two sleeps divided by a quiet waking hour, felt strange or noteworthy to the people actually living it. It was simply Tuesday. It was simply how a day and a night unfolded, over and over, for an entire lifetime, in an entire world of small ordinary households very much like this one, scattered across the whole of the English countryside and far beyond it, each one holding its own small fire, its own sleeping family, its own quiet accumulated store of habit and belief and love, most of it never written down anywhere at all, surviving only in the kind of scattered fragments we have been piecing back together for you tonight. The night deepens further now, and somewhere in the middle of it, exactly as it has happened every night of this family's life without a single one of them ever remarking on it as unusual, the first sleep loosens its hold, gently, without any sharp transition, the way a held breath eases rather than breaks. Adam surfaces first, barely, into that particular quiet wakefulness we spoke of earlier, lying still in the dark, aware of the small sounds around him, Alison's breathing beside him, the faint settling creak of the thatch overhead as the night air cools it further, the single distant call of some night bird out past the fields. He does not move, there is nothing that needs doing. He simply lies there, mind drifting loose and unhurried through nothing in particular, the coming week's tasks touched on lightly and set back down again, a fragment of the story Cecily told earlier, surfacing and fading, the particular unclenched, unpressured quality of thought that only ever seems to visit a person in exactly this kind of quiet, unwitnessed hour. After a while, he is not sure exactly how long, time itself feeling looser and less measured in this stretch of the night than it ever does during the working day. His eyes grow heavy again on their own, without any effort required to encourage them, and the second sleep arrives the way the first one did, without a clear line marking where waking ends and sleeping begins, simply a slow deepening, a settling, a surrender. I want you to notice, if you are still with me here, whether something similar might be happening in your own body right now, whether the heaviness in your own limbs has been building the same way, slowly, without any single dramatic moment where you crossed from alert into drowsy. There is no need to fight it, whatever stage you find yourself at. There is nowhere else for either of us to be tonight. The fire in the banked hearth glows on, faint and steady, exactly as it will glow on through every remaining hour of this particular night, exactly as it will need to glow on through hundreds more nights just like it, tended each evening with the same careful hands, coaxed each morning back into new flame with the same practiced patient breath. Winter is coming for this family, not so very far off now, the fields already beginning their slow turn from green to gold, to the bare brown of a season's rest, and when it arrives, this same hearth, this same small room, will hold them through the coldest and darkest stretch of their entire year, exactly as it has held every family in this village through every winter anyone can remember, exactly as it will go on doing, quietly, faithfully, long after every person sleeping in this room tonight has been laid to rest themselves, and their grandchildren's grandchildren have taken up the same small nightly ritual of banking the same kind of fire in a house not so very different from this one. There is a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, plain, sturdy, iron-bound at each worn corner, that holds nearly everything of real value this family owns beyond the tools of Adam's daily trade and the animals sheltered on the other side of the low dividing wall, and I find myself wanting to open it for you now, gently, in the dark, the way you might quietly take stock of a life by looking at what it has chosen to keep. There is a length of good wool cloth, dyed a deep and genuinely lovely blue, that cost Alison more than she likes to admit, set aside carefully, waiting for the day Marjorie marries and needs a dress finer than anything in her current, well-worn wardrobe. There is a single pewter spoon, the only piece of metal tableware the household owns, everything else being carved from wood, and it belonged to Adam's own father before him, kept not for its modest monetary value, which is real but small, but for the plain fact of whose hands held it before his own did. There is a small carved wooden horse, rough and simple, that Adam made for Wat 2 winters back during exactly this kind of long dark evening, whittled slowly by firelight over several nights running, and Wat, though nearly too old now to properly play with it, still keeps it tucked near his side of the bed, unable quite yet to let it go. And there is a folded scrap of paper, genuinely rare and genuinely valuable in this household, precisely because so very few people they know can read or write at all, on which a travelling clerk, paid a small fee some years back at Alison's own request, wrote out the exact words of a prayer she wanted kept, not because she could read it herself, but because holding a physical object containing exactly the right words, blessed by their careful correct recording, felt to her like its own small form of protection, worth the modest cost. Cecily thinks this a slightly foolish extravagance, and has said so more than once, though not unkindly, and Alison keeps the paper anyway, tucked carefully at the very bottom of the chest, beneath the blue cloth, exactly where it has sat, unopened and untouched, for 3 years running. None of these objects would strike you as remarkable, laid out on a table in front of you, and yet each one carries, folded inside it, an entire small history, a whole private constellation of hope and memory and quiet unspoken love that this family will likely never fully articulate aloud to each other, not because the feeling is not there, but because this is simply not a world that spends much of its scarce daylight hours narrating its own emotions. The feeling lives instead in the keeping of things, in a pewter spoon passed down, rather than sold even in a lean year, in a length of blue cloth set carefully aside for a wedding still years away, in a small wooden horse a father made by firelight because he wanted, in the only language this life had really taught him to speak fluently, to tell his son something he loved him. The whole village, stretched out now in darkness beyond this one small house, functions in a way that is worth holding in your mind as one final complete picture before we let this particular night finish settling around us. No single household here truly stands alone, in the way a modern house, self-sufficient behind its own locked door, so often does. When the roof of the family 2 doors down needed rethatching last spring, half the able-bodied men of the village turned out for the better part of 2 days to help, paid in nothing more than shared food and drink and the entirely understood expectation that the favour would be returned in kind whenever their own roof, or barn, or fence, next needed the same. When a birth grows difficult, women from 3 or 4 neighbouring houses gather at once, without needing to be formally summoned, simply because word travels fast in a place this small, and everyone understands, without discussion, exactly what their presence is for. When death comes, and it does come, to every household eventually, in every century, the whole village turns out for it too, not as obligation exactly, but as something closer to instinct, a collective recognition that grief, like harvest, like a roof needing mending, is not really a thing any single family is expected to carry entirely alone. This is, I think, one of the quieter differences between this world and your own, that is worth sitting with tonight, not to romanticize a life that was also undeniably harder and shorter and more physically demanding than the one you presently enjoy, but simply to notice it honestly. Adam and Alison will likely never once, across their entire lives, experience the particular modern ache of feeling unseen by the people living closest to them, because that kind of isolation, so common and so quietly painful in a great many lives today, simply has no real room to exist in a village this small, this interdependent, this thoroughly woven together by centuries of shared obligation and shared memory. There is a cost to that closeness too, undeniably, less privacy, less room to be entirely unknown, everyone's business, genuinely everyone's business, in a way that could chafe as easily as it comforted. But tonight, in this particular dark, with this particular family sleeping soundly under this particular banked fire, I find myself thinking mostly of the comfort in it, the sheer, solid, unglamorous comfort of knowing that if something went wrong in the night, if the fire somehow got away from its careful banking, if illness struck hard and sudden, an entire village of people who have known this family their whole lives would be at the door within minutes, not because anyone asked them to be, but because that is simply, unremarkably, what a village like this one is for. When true winter finally settles over this village in the coming weeks, the evenings will lengthen considerably, darkness falling by mid-afternoon, and holding until well past what feels, even now in autumn, like a reasonable hour to still be waiting for morning, and this family's household will not spend those long dark hours entirely alone, the way tonight has largely been spent. Several evenings each week, once the very coldest and deepest part of winter properly arrives, Alison and a handful of neighbouring women will gather at one house or another in rotation, bringing their own spinning and their own mending, working together by the combined light and warmth of a single well-tended fire, rather than each burning fuel separately in their own homes, a practice that saves fuel plainly enough, but that exists just as much, if not more, for the company of it, for the chance to work through the long dark hours surrounded by familiar voices, rather than in the particular isolating silence of a single household shut in against the cold. These gatherings carry their own name in various parts of the English countryside, sometimes called a spinning bee, sometimes something else entirely depending on the region, and they function as something close to the winter equivalent of the harvest gathering or the wedding celebration, a genuine social occasion built quietly around necessary labour rather than existing separately from it. Stories get told at these gatherings too, often better and stranger ones than Cecily's usual fireside repertoire, since a room full of women pooling their combined memory produces a far richer and stranger collection of tales than any single grandmother, however skilled, could manage alone. Stories about local ghosts said to walk certain stretches of road on certain nights, about strange lights, sometimes glimpsed over the marsh at the village's edge, about a particular ancient tree at the crossroads that older residents still avoid cutting or even trimming for reasons nobody quite states outright, but everyone somehow understands. Watt and the other boys his age are excluded from these particular gatherings, which belong, by long unspoken custom, almost entirely to the women, but he has his own winter evening tradition waiting for him too, a rougher, louder equivalent held sometimes at the smithy, where Osbert and a handful of other men gather around the forge's own banked but still considerable warmth to mend tools, tell their own rather different collection of stories, and pass around whatever modest amount of stronger drink the evening allows. It strikes me, thinking about both of these gatherings at once, women in one house bent over their spinning, men at the forge trading stories of their own, how thoroughly this entire village has organized itself, almost without any single person ever deciding to, around the basic shared understanding that a long winter is a great deal easier to survive together than apart. That warmth, whether from a fire or from company, is always better pooled than hoarded. Spring, when it finally arrives again after all of that, brings with it one particular season of activity that Watt, in particular, looks forward to more than almost anything else across the entire year, lambing time, when the small flock that neighbouring family keeps begins, over the course of a few intense weeks, to produce its new generation, and the whole village, in its way, turns its attention toward the birthing shed for a while, since a healthy lambing season matters enormously to the wool that will, eventually, clothe half the households here and provide real trading income for the family who keeps the flock. Watt has been allowed, the past 2 springs running, to help watch through a difficult birth in the middle of the night, holding a rushlight steady while the shepherd works, and he has told the story of it since more than once, with the particular breathless pride of a boy who was trusted with something that felt, at the time, enormously important, which, in its own modest way, it genuinely was. There is an old folk belief, one Cecily holds to loosely in the same spirit she holds to the fairy pool offering, that a lamb born during a particular phase of the moon will grow stronger and healthier than one born under a different phase, and whether or not there is anything real behind it. Shepherds across the region time their breeding, where they have any control over the matter at all, with at least half an eye toward exactly this kind of accumulated lore, weighing it alongside more straightforwardly practical concerns about weather and available grazing. It is one small example, among a great many we have touched on tonight, of how thoroughly folk belief and practical observation braided themselves together in this world, inseparable in most people's daily thinking, each reinforcing the other in ways that would strike a modern scientific mind as confused, perhaps, but that made, within their own context, a kind of coherent and workable sense. By the time full spring settles properly over the fields, the whole rhythm we walked through together tonight will have turned another complete circle, the ploughing beginning again, the seed going back into ground that so recently gave up its harvest, Cecily's herb shelf refreshed with fresh cuttings gathered from the newly greening hedgerows, Ellen a little taller, Watt a little stronger and more useful in the fields, Marjorie perhaps, by then, finally old enough that this coming May Day will be the one where she truly joins the dancing rather than merely watching from its edge. Nothing about this cycle is new to anyone living inside it. It has turned this same way, more or less, for as long as anyone in the village can remember, and it will turn this same way again, more or less, for a good while longer yet. Each small variation, a harder winter here, a better harvest there, folded into a rhythm so old and so deeply worn that it has stopped feeling, to the people living inside it, like a rhythm at all. It simply feels like life, which of course is exactly what it is. It is worth pausing, before we let this night fully close around us, to think for a moment about what actually lies ahead for children like Watt and Marjorie, because inheritance in a family like this one follows a pattern that would surprise a good many modern listeners, shaped by a custom called primogeniture in its strictest form among the nobility, though applied somewhat more loosely and practically among families of Adam's station. Broadly speaking, the family's small holding of land will eventually pass, when the time comes, to Watt, as the eldest son, rather than being divided evenly among all three children, a system that strikes modern sensibilities as unfair toward Marjorie and Ellen, and in some very real sense it was exactly that, but it existed for a practical reason that mattered enormously in a world where land, once divided too many times across too many generations, could shrink down into parcels too small for any single family to actually survive on. Better, by this logic, that one child inherit a viable holding than that three children each inherit a share too small to feed a family of their own. This meant in practice that Marjorie's future runs along a rather different path than her brother's, one built primarily around marriage, and a modest dowry Alison has been slowly assembling in that wooden chest at the foot of the bed represents a genuinely significant piece of planning for exactly this eventual future, a foundation on which Marjorie's own new household, once she marries, can begin to build. Ellen's path remains, for now, entirely unwritten, 4 years old and years still from any of these questions mattering directly to her, though her parents are already, in the quiet unspoken way parents in every century plan for children too young to know they are being planned for, aware that with one daughter's dowry already being built toward, a second daughter's eventual marriage will require its own careful years of saving. Not every younger child stays within the village at all, and this too is worth knowing, since it complicates any picture of medieval rural life as entirely static and unchanging generation after generation. Younger sons without land to inherit often left for the nearest town in search of an apprenticeship in some trade, exactly as Osbert himself once did as a boy, and while the journey from field to forge or field to workshop was neither easy nor guaranteed to succeed, it represented a genuine, well-worn path of social movement that existed alongside, and somewhat in tension with, the popular modern image of medieval society as a rigid hierarchy where everyone remained forever fixed in whatever position they were born into. People moved, in modest but genuinely meaningful ways, across their own lifetimes and across generations, toward towns, toward trades, occasionally through unusually good fortune or unusually hard work, toward a level of prosperity their own parents could never have imagined for them. Cecily's own place within this household, sleeping nearest the fire where the cold reaches last, deferred to first at every meal without exception, consulted on every question of herb lore and omen and calendar, reflects something else worth understanding honestly about old age in a world like this one. There was no separate arrangement waiting for her, no institution built specifically to house the elderly once they could no longer keep pace with a younger generation's full workload, and this was not, on the whole, experienced as a hardship by families like Adam's, so much as simply the plain, unquestioned shape of how a family functioned across its full span, the young cared for by the working aged eventually cared for, in their own turn, by children who had grown up watching exactly this pattern modelled in front of them every single day of their own upbringing. Cecily contributes what she can, her herb knowledge, her memory of custom and calendar, a genuine and considerable amount of the actual daily childcare that keeps Ellen occupied, while Alison's hands are busy elsewhere, and in exchange she is fed, sheltered, kept warm nearest the fire through the coldest months, and treated, throughout, with a level of built-in respect that required no separate justification beyond the plain fact of her years and her relationship to the family around her. This arrangement would not have felt to Cecily like charity, and it would not have felt to Adam like burden, not because either of them was somehow more virtuous than you or I, but because the entire structure of expectation surrounding old age simply ran along different lines than it often does now, generations sharing not just affection but literal physical space and daily labor across an entire lifetime, in a continuous overlapping way that a world of separate households, separate cities, separate careers pulling grown children hundreds of miles from their aging parents has made considerably rarer, for reasons that are not anyone's particular fault, simply the accumulated shape of how an entirely different kind of world happens to be organized. Death itself, when it eventually comes to any member of this household, as it comes to every household in every century without exception, will be met here with genuine grief, real and deeply felt, but also with a kind of practiced communal ritual that a world less constantly surrounded by death than this one tends to lack. The whole village will gather, exactly as they gather for a wedding or a harvest, and there will be a wake, a vigil kept over the body through the night before burial, candles if the family can manage them, prayers, the particular low murmured conversation of neighbours trading memories of the person who has died, and afterward, burial in the churchyard that has held this village's dead for longer than anyone can precisely say, generations of the same families resting, quite literally, within a few steps of the church where their own children were baptized and their own weddings were held. The whole cycle of a life, beginning, middle and end, gathered together within the space of a single small churchyard that every person in this village will walk past without any particular sense of unease on the way to market most weeks of their lives. There is a small pit dug into the ground just outside the house, lined with straw and covered over with a wooden hatch, that serves this family as something close to a root cellar, holding turnips, onions, and whatever else from the small garden plot needs to survive the coming cold months without spoiling, and the whole business of food preservation, smoking meat over the hearth's own smoke, salting what salt can be afforded, drying herbs and fruit, storing root vegetables in cool, dark earth, represents an entire body of practical, hard-won knowledge that this family carries with the same unconscious fluency you might carry knowledge of which supermarket aisle holds which item, knowledge so deeply absorbed through repetition that it barely registers, to the people holding it, as knowledge at all. Alison knows, without needing to think about it, exactly how long a piece of bacon can hang smoking before it is ready, exactly how much salt a joint of meat needs to keep safely through a mild winter versus a harsh one, exactly which herbs, dried and hung in which order, will still hold their potency come the following spring, and which will have lost most of their strength by then. News of the wider kingdom, the king, whichever one currently sits the throne, his wars, his marriages, his disputes with powerful nobles, reaches this household only rarely and always second-hand, carried by the peddler or the tinker. or occasionally by the priest, who receives word through the church's own considerably better organized network of communication stretching all the way up through bishops and eventually to Rome itself. Adam has a rough working sense of who currently rules and a vague awareness that there has been trouble, on and off, with France for as long as he can remember, but the details of high politics touch his actual daily life so lightly, so indirectly, that he rarely thinks about them at all beyond the occasional evening's gossip when news happens to pass through. This is again worth sitting with for a moment. How thoroughly local, how thoroughly bounded by this one village and its immediate neighbours, and ordinary life like Adam's actually was, in an era that grand history books tend to narrate almost entirely through the actions of kings and armies, who, in truth, occupied only the very faintest edge of most people's actual daily awareness. Counting and measuring, in this household, work rather differently than you might expect too, worth a brief mention before we let this night close fully around us. Adam cannot read, but he can count perfectly well, tracking his obligations to the manor, the days of labour owed, the portion of grain due at Michaelmas, through a set of notched tally sticks, a simple and remarkably effective system where cuts of varying depth and position, carved into a length of wood, record a debt or a payment in a form both parties can verify without either one needing to read a single written word. The exchequer of the kingdom itself, at the very highest level of royal finance, used essentially this same tally stick system to track enormous sums owed to the crown, a detail that tends to surprise people who assume something as basic as notched wood belonged only to illiterate peasants, rather than sitting at the very heart of national accounting as well. Measurement of goods at market runs on a similarly practical, physically grounded system, a bushel here, an ell of cloth there, an ell being, roughly, the length from a man's outstretched fingertips to his shoulder, a measurement carried quite literally in the body of whoever happens to be doing the measuring, which produced, admittedly, no small amount of local variation and occasional dispute, exactly the kind of small dispute the reeve or the village's own informal social pressure existed to settle. The days themselves have been shortening steadily these past weeks, as autumn deepens toward the winter we have spoken of several times tonight, and this family, like every family in the village, feels that shortening not as an abstract fact about the calendar, but as a direct, physical pressure on how much can actually get done in a single day's available light. Adam has been rising earlier and earlier to make full use of what daylight remains for the fields, and Alison has quietly begun shifting more of her own work, the spinning especially, toward whatever task can be managed by firelight alone, anticipating the coming weeks when full darkness will fall well before either of them feels genuinely ready for the working day to end. There is no fighting this shift, no way to hold back the shortening days any more than you can hold back the tide, and so this household, like every household around it, simply adjusts, quietly, without complaint, the same patient accommodation to the turning of the year that every generation before them has made, and every generation after them will go on making too. Not many weeks passed, at the very end of October, the village kept All Hallows and the days immediately following it, a custom that survives today, in a form thoroughly reshaped and largely emptied of its original meaning, as a very different kind of autumn holiday, but that carried in this household's own lived experience a gentler and more contemplative character than you might expect. Small round cakes, spiced simply with whatever this family could spare, were baked and given out, a practice called souling offered to children and to poorer neighbours who went from door to door in the days around the feast, and in exchange, custom held, the recipient would offer a prayer for the souls of the giving household's own dead, tying directly back into that earlier belief about purgatory and the ongoing power of the living to ease a departed soul's passage through it. Ellen went with Marjorie that evening to 2 neighbouring houses, her small hands cupped carefully around her single soul cake the whole walk home, and Cecily, receiving her own share from a neighbour's child at the door, murmured a genuine, unhurried prayer afterward for her own long-departed husband, a small private ritual folded seamlessly into what looked, from the outside, like nothing more than children collecting a sweet treat. It is worth, for just a moment, setting this household briefly beside a somewhat wealthier neighbouring family, yeoman farmers who hold rather more land outright than Adam does, and who employ in busier seasons a hired hand or two beyond their own family's labour, because the comparison sharpens exactly how much genuine variation existed within what gets flattened, in popular imagination, into a single undifferentiated peasant experience. That family's house has 2 rooms rather than 1, a small private chamber where the parents sleep apart from the children, a luxury Adams household cannot currently manage. Their table sees meat somewhat more regularly than this family's does, and their children's clothing runs to slightly finer cloth, though not by any means to the dyed luxury reserved for actual nobility, and yet the fundamental rhythm of their days, the fire kept alive overnight, the shared labour of harvest, the same church calendar structuring the year, the same folk beliefs about thresholds and left sides of beds and offerings left near old trees, remains recognisably, thoroughly the same, a reminder that the differences within this world, real and meaningful as they were to the people living through them, sat within a much narrower band than the enormous gulf separating any of these households, wealthier or poorer, from the genuine luxury enjoyed by the nobility further up the social order still. Here is one final surprising fact worth sitting with before we let this whole long day and this whole long night finally close around us completely, because it runs so thoroughly against the popular image of medieval life as endless grinding toil without pause, counting every Sunday, every saint's day observed by the local parish, every additional feast and holy day scattered through the church calendar we walked through earlier tonight, Christmas, Easter, all the smaller observances layered between them. A family like Adam's likely rested from ordinary labour on somewhere between 80 and 100 days across a full year, a proportion of rest days that stacks up remarkably well against, and by some counts genuinely exceeds, the total vacation and holiday time available to a great many working people in your own world today. Rest, in other words, was not simply the rare, hard-won exception in this life that popular imagination often assumes. It was built directly into the structure of the calendar itself, woven so thoroughly into the rhythm of the working year, that nobody living inside it would have thought to describe it as generous, any more than you would describe your own weekend as a remarkable act of generosity from your employer. It was simply how the year worked, one more inheritance from a church calendar that shaped almost every other aspect of daily life we have touched on tonight besides. On some of the larger feast days, particularly in the nearby market town rather than in a village this small, the trade guilds would put on mystery plays, dramatic performances retelling biblical stories, Noah and his ark, the Nativity, the Crucifixion and Resurrection, each story traditionally assigned to whichever guild's craft connected to it in some symbolic way. The shipbuilders taking on Noah's Ark, the bakers taking on the Last Supper, performed on wagons that moved through the town's streets across an entire day, stopping at different points so the gathered crowd could watch each new scene unfold in turn. Adam and Alison saw one such cycle of plays years ago, before the children were born, on a rare visit to the market town timed deliberately around the performance, and Alison still describes it, on the rare occasions it comes up, with a kind of wonder that has not faded across all the years since, the ordinary craftsmen of the town, men she might otherwise have bought bread or nails from without a second thought, transformed for one single afternoon into Noah, into an angel, into a devil complete with a blackened mask that made half the watching children shriek with a mixture of genuine fright and genuine delight. There is a particular quality of self-awareness, or rather a particular different shape of it, worth touching on gently before we finally let this family sleep undisturbed for the rest of the night, because it is easy, hearing so many details about calendar and custom and belief, to lose sight of something plain and important, that Adam and Alison and even young Marjorie experienced their own inner lives with just as much complexity and depth as you experience yours right now, even without any of the language or framework you might use to describe that inner life. There was no diary tradition reaching down to a family of this station, no private journal where Alison might have recorded, in her own words, exactly what she felt watching her children grow, exactly what worry or hope moved through her in the quiet hour before sleep. That absence of written record has led, across the centuries since, to a persistent and rather unfair impression that ordinary medieval people simply felt less, thought less, experienced their own existence with less interior richness than people do now, when the far more likely truth is simply that they had no habit, no tradition, and often no literacy at all through which to preserve that inner life in a form that could survive them. I think about this sometimes, how much of any single human life, in any century at all, including your own tonight, disappears without any trace at all beyond the people who happen to witness it directly, how the vast majority of what you yourself think and feel across an entire lifetime will likely never be written down anywhere, will exist only in the moment of its happening, and then in whatever fragments of memory the people who loved you happen to carry forward afterward. Alison's own private hopes for her daughters, her own quiet grief carried for a mother she has not stopped missing, her own small private satisfactions, a well-risen loaf, a well-mended shirt, a daughter's laughter at a feast day dance, none of it survives in any record at all beyond this story we have imagined together tonight, built from the careful accumulated evidence of 1,000 households very much like hers, rather than from any single preserved account of her own particular life. And yet I do not think that absence makes her interior life any less real, any less full, any less worth honouring than your own tonight, recorded though yours might be, in fragments across photographs and messages and the countless small digital traces a modern life leaves behind, almost without trying. The particular position of this house within its village, near enough to the church that the bell reaches it clearly, near enough to Osbert's forge and Joan's house, and the small green where feast day dancing happens, that every important thread of this family's daily life sits within an easy walk, was not accidental, and villages across medieval England grew, generation after generation, according to a logic that, while never formally planned by any single authority the way a modern town might be zoned and platted, nonetheless produced remarkably sensible, walkable, tightly woven little settlements, the church near the centre, houses clustered close along a small number of lanes rather than scattered widely apart, fields stretching out beyond the houses in the shared strips we discussed earlier tonight. This closeness, houses set near enough to each other that a raised voice carries easily from one to the next, that smoke from one chimney mingles with smoke from the next, that a child playing in the lane is watched, loosely and without any formal arrangement, by whichever adult happens to glance out a doorway at any given moment, produced a kind of ambient, low-effort communal supervision and communal awareness that shaped this family's whole experience of safety and belonging in ways so constant and so background that nobody living inside it would have thought to name it as anything remarkable at all. Adam remembers, from his own childhood, being scolded once by a neighbour 3 houses down for some minor mischief his own mother never actually witnessed directly, and receiving, upon arriving home, a second scolding from his mother for the very same offence, the neighbour having mentioned it to her before he had even made it back through his own door. A small memory that still makes him smile faintly, decades later, at the sheer impossibility of getting away with anything at all in a village this size, this closely woven, this thoroughly and permanently aware of exactly which child belonged to which house, and exactly what that child ought and ought not to be doing on any given afternoon. There is one more small custom worth mentioning before we return fully to the sleeping house, tied to the particular threshold Ellen stumbled over earlier this evening, because doorways and boundaries of every kind carried a weight of meaning in this world that stretched well beyond that single small incident. A new bride on her wedding day is traditionally carried across the threshold of her new husband's house rather than walking across it herself, a custom that survives, thoroughly stripped of its original reasoning, into weddings still celebrated today, and the reasoning behind it, in this era, ties directly back into that same old belief about thresholds as places where spirits and ill fortune gather, a bride considered particularly vulnerable on the very day her old household protections lapse and her new ones have not yet fully taken hold. Iron, too, carried protective weight in the folk belief woven through this household's daily habits, a simple horseshoe nailed above the door of more than one house in this village, points turned upward by most local custom, though the exact orientation varied depending on which older relative you asked, believed to catch and hold good fortune rather than let it spill back out the open end. Salt, which we spoke of earlier at market, carried this same double weight, practical and symbolic at once, a small pinch sometimes thrown over the shoulder if spilled, a superstition surviving in some form all the way to your own present-day kitchen, tracing back to a belief that spilled salt opened a small gap through which misfortune, or something worse, could slip in, and that a pinch thrown quickly over the left shoulder into the very darkness where ill luck was thought to lurk could close that gap again before any harm managed to pass through it. Cecily still performs this small gesture without fail, automatically, whenever a pinch of the precious substance scatters across the table during cooking, and none of the younger members of the household have ever once thought to ask her why. The habit simply absorbed, the way so much in this house has been absorbed, through nothing more than years of watching without ever needing an explanation offered alongside it. Let me tell you about one more object before we finally rest, because I think it captures something true about this whole household better than almost anything else we have touched on tonight. Hanging from a peg near the door, within easy reach of anyone stepping outside after dark, is a small clay lamp shaped almost like a shallow dish with a pinched lip, filled with animal fat rather than oil, since oil for lamps, the kind pressed from olives that lit so much of the wealthier Mediterranean world, simply does not grow in this cool, wet corner of England, and would cost, if it could even be obtained at all this far north, more than this family could ever reasonably justify. A twist of coarse fibre serves as a wick, floating in the fat, and this small lamp, older than any of the children, older even than Adam and Alison's marriage, has been repaired twice, once by Osbert himself when a hairline crack threatened to let its contents leak away entirely, and it continues, patched and worn and perfectly serviceable, to do exactly the single modest job it has always done, providing just enough light for the short walk to the animal pen or the privy on a night too dark and too moonless for the eye to manage entirely unaided. It is such a small, unremarkable, easily overlooked thing, this little clay lamp, patched and dented and stained dark with years of accumulated smoke. It will never appear in any museum, never be remarked upon by any visiting dignitary, never feature in any account of this era grand enough to survive the centuries in any library or archive, and yet it has been present, faithfully, for every single night of Marjorie's entire life, for every single night of Watt's, hanging exactly where it hangs now, ready exactly when it is needed, asking nothing in return beyond an occasional careful refilling and the rare repair when age and use finally catch up with it. I find myself, more than once tonight, drawn back to precisely this kind of object, the plain, patched, faithfully ordinary thing that outlasts entire seasons and holds an entire household's small daily needs without ever once being thanked for it, because I think there is something in that quiet reliability worth noticing, worth almost admiring, in a way that has very little to do with how grand or how remarkable a thing appears from the outside. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night now, past a point where even the watch between sleeps has come and gone for most of this household, the temperature outside drops further still, the particular sharp clean cold of a clear autumn night with no cloud cover to hold the day's modest warmth close to the earth, and inside, the banked fire answers that dropping cold exactly as it was built to, its slow, steady smoulder holding the small room at a temperature that would strike you, waking suddenly into it from your own centrally heated bedroom, as genuinely cool, perhaps even properly cold near the edges of the room furthest from the hearth, and yet entirely sufficient, entirely survivable, entirely what 5 sleeping bodies and 1 banked fire have always managed together in a house built exactly for this purpose. Watt has pulled the shared blanket a little further over himself sometime in his sleep, an unconscious small negotiation for warmth that happens without anyone quite waking to notice it, several times most nights in a bed shared this closely, and Marjorie beside him has not stirred at all, deep in the particular dreamless heavy sleep that a full day of real physical activity tends to earn a child her age. Ellen shifts once, murmurs something entirely unintelligible, and settles again almost instantly, her grandmother's arm curled loosely around her the whole time, without either of them ever fully waking to register the small adjustment. Cecily herself sleeps lighter than the rest, as the very old so often do, surfacing partway into wakefulness more than once across any given night, though rarely enough, and briefly enough, that she could not have told you the next morning exactly how many times it happened, only that it happened, the way it happens most nights, a shallow rhythm of near waking and resettling that has become, across so many decades, simply how her own particular sleep behaves now, different from how it behaved when she was Marjorie's age, different again from how it will behave, presumably, in whatever years remain ahead of her, sleep itself changing shape gradually across an entire lifetime, the way so much else about a body changes shape, quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking the shift. Tomorrow, when it finally arrives, will look, in its broad shape, almost exactly like today did, and the day before that, and the countless days stretching back before any of them. Alison rising first to coax the banked fire back to flame, the children waking one by one into the particular cool grey light of a morning not yet fully begun, Adam checking the sky before he checks anything else, the whole household moving through the same worn, comfortable grooves of habit that have carried it, intact and functioning, through every season this family has ever known together, and yet tomorrow will also, in its own small way, be entirely new, unrepeatable, its own single unrepeated day within an entire unrepeatable life, whatever small variation the weather brings, whatever small piece of news the day happens to carry, whatever small unremarkable moment of connection or friction or quiet joy passes between the people sharing this one small room, never to occur in exactly that same combination again. This is, I think, true of every single ordinary day in every century, including the one you are living through right now, tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. The days blur together, in memory, into something that feels repetitive, routine, hardly worth individually recalling, and yet each one, examined closely enough, holds its own small unrepeatable texture, its own particular quality of light, its own particular fleeting thought or feeling that will never occur again in quite that exact same shape. Adam and Alison will never know that a stranger, centuries later, sat quietly imagining the precise details of this one particular autumn night in their small ordinary life, the banked fire, the shared bed, the small clay lamp by the door, and found in it, somehow, a version of the same peace that they themselves are, right now, deeply and dreamlessly asleep inside. Before we let this particular night close entirely, I want to gather up, gently, a few of the threads we have followed together, not to summarize them in any tidy way, but simply to let them sit alongside each other one final time, the way scattered coals sit together under a bank of ash, each one small on its own, each one, together, holding enough warmth to last until morning. A fire kept alive not by lighting it fresh each day, but by protecting a single ember through the whole of the night, careful enough that an entire word you still use today, curfew, grew directly out of the habit. A bed that required, quite literally, tightening its ropes to sleep well, giving you a phrase you have used your whole life without ever knowing where it came from. A family sleeping not in one long unbroken stretch, but in two, a first sleep and a second, separated by an hour of quiet, unhurried, entirely ordinary wakefulness in the middle of the night, met with no anxiety at all, simply accepted as the natural shape a night takes. A whole village bound together not by choice exactly, but by centuries of shared obligation, shared labour, shared grief and shared celebration, so tightly woven that isolation, in the way you might sometimes feel it in your own life, could barely find room to exist inside it. A grandmother's shelf of herbs holding, side by side, genuine working medicine and gentle well-meaning superstition, neither one fully separable from the other in the mind of the woman who gathered and dried and hung each bundle with her own careful hands. A small clay lamp, patched and imperfect and utterly reliable, doing its single modest job for decades without complaint or acknowledgement, none of it dramatic, none of it the version of medieval life you would find in a film, all banners and battles and grand castle halls, all of it, instead, simply, quietly, completely ordinary, which is exactly, I think, why it deserves to be remembered at all. There is a particular kind of comfort I have found in stories like this one, stories about lives so thoroughly ordinary that history mostly forgot to write them down at all, and it is worth naming honestly what that comfort actually is, because I do not think it is simple escapism, not really. It is something closer to reassurance, the quiet reassurance of realizing just how much of what feels, in your own life, like unremarkable routine, the making of breakfast, the mending of a torn shirt, the low-murmured conversation with someone you love at the end of a long day, the careful tending of whatever small fire keeps your own household running, connects you to an almost unbroken chain of other people, in other centuries, doing essentially the very same things, feeling very likely something very close to what you feel doing them. Alison worrying quietly about whether the stored food will stretch through winter is not so very different, in its essential shape, from whatever quiet worry you might carry about your own household's finances, your own family's health, your own small daily obligations. The details differ enormously. The underlying human experience of care, of worry, of quiet daily love expressed through unremarkable repeated labour does not seem to differ nearly as much. I think that is worth carrying with you tonight, as you finally let yourself drift the rest of the way into sleep. You are not so very far removed, whatever your own house looks like, however it is heated, however brightly lit it stays long after the sun goes down, from a woman like Alison, banking her own version of a fire every single night of her life, trusting a small, careful ritual to carry her family safely through the dark, waking each morning to coax new warmth and new light back out of what was so carefully protected through the hours of sleep. The specific shape of the ritual has changed almost beyond recognition. The impulse behind it, the quiet nightly act of care that makes tomorrow morning possible, has not changed nearly as much as 8 centuries might lead you to expect. The last coal in that carefully banked hearth glows on, faint and orange and utterly steady, exactly as it will glow on through every remaining hour of darkness left in this particular night, exactly as it glowed on through every night before this one that this family has ever shared together in this small room, exactly as it will glow on tomorrow night, and the night after that, tended and protected by the same careful hands, asking nothing of the family sleeping around it beyond the small nightly ritual of ash and ember that keeps it alive. Outside, the village sleeps too, house after house holding its own version of the very same small glowing heart, a whole community of tiny protected fires scattered across the dark countryside, each one utterly ordinary, each one in its own quiet way, keeping an entire household safe through hours that would otherwise hold nothing but cold and total dark. If you were to walk the length of the lane tonight, past Joan's house, past the smithy where Osbert's own forge fire smoulders under its own careful bank of ash, past the church with its silent painted walls and its small locked box of relic and memory, you would find, behind every closed door, some quiet version of exactly the same scene we have spent this whole night sitting inside, a family settled, a fire banked, a whole small world holding itself steady until morning. I think I will leave you here, in this room, with this family, with this fire. There is nothing more that needs to happen tonight. The story has done what a story like this one is meant to do. Walked you gently through an entire day and most of a night, through fire and bread and wool and worship and worry and love, through 100 small unremarkable customs that once felt, to the people living them, like nothing at all worth remarking on, and that feel, held up now in the quiet dark of your own room, centuries later, genuinely, unexpectedly precious. Ellen, small as she is tonight, curled so completely into sleep against her grandmother's side, will grow, across the years ahead, into a woman who carries forward every single one of these customs without ever once thinking of them as customs at all, simply as the correct and obvious way a house is run. A fire is kept, a family is fed and clothed and protected through a long English winter. She will learn Cecily's herb lore eventually, most of it passed down exactly as it was passed down to Cecily herself, and some small piece of it will travel forward again through her, to a daughter of her own not yet born, not yet even imagined on this particular autumn night, and some other small piece will simply end, forgotten, lost the way so much of this kind of unwritten household knowledge inevitably gets lost somewhere along an unbroken but imperfect chain, stretching across generations. This is, I think, simply how most human knowledge has always travelled, imperfectly, generously, mother to daughter, father to son, master to apprentice, most of it never once written down, all of it nonetheless real, nonetheless valuable, nonetheless deeply felt by the people passing it carefully from one pair of hands into the next. And somewhere in that long unbroken chain, reaching forward from this one small autumn night, all the way to your own bedroom right now, There is a kind of quiet continuity worth resting inside for these last few minutes together. The fire Alison banked tonight is long since cold, has been cold for the better part of 1,000 years, and yet the plain human impulse behind it, the desire to protect something small and warm through a long dark stretch of time, to wake tomorrow to find it still glowing, still capable of being coaxed back into full flame, has not gone anywhere at all. You carry some version of that same impulse tonight too, whatever form it takes in your own life, however far removed it might seem from a woman kneeling at a hearth in the dark 8 centuries ago. There is one last small scene worth lingering in before we finally let this night close completely, because it circles back, gently, to exactly where we began, somewhere in the deepest, stillest hour before any hint of dawn. Long before Alison will rise to coax tomorrow's fire back to life, the house holds itself in a kind of perfect suspended quiet, 5 human bodies and 1 small watchful cat, and on the far side of the dividing wall, a scatter of settled, breathing animals, all of them held together inside walls of timber and daub that have sheltered, across the years this family has lived here, births and illnesses and ordinary Tuesdays beyond counting. The thatch overhead does its own quiet work through this stretch of night, shedding the light frost beginning to form on its outer surface, holding warmth in below the way it has been holding warmth in since long before Adam himself was born in this very room. Nothing moves, nothing needs to move. This is simply what an ordinary medieval night looks like, held perfectly still for hour after hour after hour, while an entire small world rests inside it. Think for a moment about how many nights exactly like this one this particular family has already shared, and how many more lie ahead of them that neither you nor they can see from where we are standing now. Thousands of nights, most of them entirely unremarkable, blurring together the way any long stretch of ordinary nights blurs together in memory, a handful of them touched by illness or worry or genuine hardship, a good many more touched by nothing more dramatic than exactly what we have witnessed tonight, a fire banked, a story told, a family settled safely into sleep. This is the actual texture of an ordinary medieval life, not the singular dramatic turning points that history books tend to fixate on, but this vast unremarkable accumulation of ordinary nights, one after another, each one nearly identical to the last. Each one, in its own small way, a quiet private victory simply for having happened safely at all. It occurs to me, sitting with this family one final time before we part, that there is something worth borrowing from them tonight, some small piece of their unhurried, unbothered relationship with rest itself. They do not lie awake worrying about whether they are sleeping correctly, whether their 2 segmented sleeps meet some ideal standard, whether tomorrow's tasks are being adequately planned for during tonight's hours of rest. They simply sleep when their bodies are ready, wake briefly if they wake at all, and sleep again, trusting the whole process entirely, without any of the anxious self-monitoring that a great many people bring to their own rest in your own busier, brighter, more measured century. There might be something worth quietly adopting in that, some of that same unhurried trust, as you let yourself settle the rest of the way into your own sleep tonight. Cecily, in her lightest stretch of near waking sometime before true dawn, hears, very faintly, the first stirring of a bird somewhere beyond the thatch, not yet full birdsong, just a single tentative note tried out and abandoned, the earliest possible hint that morning, however many hours off it still remains, has already quietly begun preparing itself somewhere past the edge of what anyone in this house can presently see or hear. She does not open her eyes, she does not need to, she simply notes it the way she has noted this exact same small sound at this exact same deep hour more mornings than she could ever hope to count across a genuinely long life, and lets herself sink back down into the last stretch of sleep still waiting for her, unhurried, unworried, certain, the way this whole household is certain, that everything necessary has already been done, and that morning, whenever it finally chooses to arrive, will find them ready for it. I want to leave you with one more small detail, the kind that has stayed with me since I first came across it, because it captures something about this whole vanished world better than almost anything grander could. Archaeologists digging through the remains of villages very much like this one, abandoned centuries ago for reasons ranging from plague to changing farming patterns to simple, slow depopulation, have found, again and again, buried near old hearths, just like this family's, small, deliberately placed objects, a single worn shoe, a scrap of cloth, occasionally a small dead animal, tucked into the very foundations of a house or pushed carefully up into a chimney space during construction or repair. Historians have come to understand these as a form of protective concealment, offerings made quietly, without ceremony, to guard a household against fire, against misfortune, against whatever unnamed dangers a family felt hovering at the edges of their daily life, tucked away and then, quite literally, built over, sealed permanently into the very structure of the home, doing their silent protective work for as long as the house itself stood. There is something in that practice, hidden and humble and entirely unrecorded in any written source, that feels to me like a perfect small emblem for everything we have spent tonight exploring together. A family cannot control the weather, cannot control illness, cannot control whether the harvest holds or fails, cannot control so very much of what shapes an ordinary medieval life from one season to the next. And so they did what people in every century have always done with exactly that kind of powerlessness. They built small, quiet, deeply felt rituals around the edges of it. A shoe hidden in a chimney, a coin left at a threshold, a pinch of milk poured near an old oak tree, a fire banked with exactly the right careful measure of ash, each one a small private act of hope, tucked into the structure of an ordinary life and trusted, without any need for proof, to hold back whatever darkness might otherwise creep in. Adam's own house, this very house we have spent the whole of tonight inside, holds one such object too, though none of the family currently sleeping in it has ever thought to mention it, because it was placed there, sealed into a gap beside the chimney's base, by Adam's own grandfather 2 generations back, and its exact purpose and exact meaning have long since blurred into simple inherited habit, the kind of thing done because it has always been done, protection layered quietly into the very bones of a house that has sheltered 4 generations of the same family and shows every sign, standing steady and warm around its sleeping occupants tonight, of sheltering a good many more. Think back for just a moment over everything this one ordinary night has held. A single ember, protected under ash, that gave an entire language the word curfew. A bed whose ropes needed tightening, giving you a phrase you have used your whole life without knowing its origin. A whole family sleeping in 2 gentle segments rather than one long stretch. An hour of quiet waking tucked peacefully between them, considered no stranger than breathing itself, bread that doubled as a plate, a cat that earned its keep and was loved anyway, a grandmother's shelf holding both real medicine and gentle superstition side by side, inseparable in her own mind, a tinker fed without payment because feeding a stranger on the road was simply what a decent household did, a village bound so tightly together by shared labour and shared grief that loneliness, in the way you might sometimes feel it, could hardly find room to take hold. All of it ordinary, all of it once simply Tuesday. And underneath every single one of these small customs, the very same thing you are doing right now, in your own bed, in your own century, in whatever quiet room is currently holding you. Settling, trusting the dark, letting a full day's worth of effort finally set itself down. Alison did this every single night of her life, without ever once thinking of it as anything worth remarking on. You are doing it too, right now, and it is worth remarking on, gently, warmly, one final time before I let you go. You have done everything you needed to do today. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to plan, nothing left to carry. The fire, wherever your own version of it burns, is banked. It will still be there, waiting, glowing quietly, exactly when you need it again tomorrow morning. Somewhere past the edge of this village, past the last cultivated field and the old oak where Cecily still leaves her small offering of milk, the road continues on, the same road the tinker travelled this morning, the same road that will one day, though not for many years yet, carry a grown Watt toward whatever future waits for him beyond these fields, the same road that connected this one small cluster of houses to every other village and every other family living out their own version of this exact same ordinary night, all across the whole of the English countryside, all across a much wider world beyond it, that this family will never see and never needs to see for their own small life to feel entirely, quietly complete. It is strange and rather lovely to think about, all of it happening at once, all of it happening in the dark, hundreds and thousands of small firelit rooms just like this one, each holding its own sleeping family, each protected by its own carefully banked ember, each entirely unaware of all the others, and yet bound together, in the end, by exactly the same simple human need for warmth, for safety, for rest. You are part of that same long unbroken thread tonight too. Whether you feel it or not, whatever the shape of your own room, your own bed, your own particular version of settling down after a long day, the details have changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying need has not changed nearly as much as 8 centuries might suggest it should have. Rest well. Let the last of today's weight settle and disperse, the way ash settles slowly over glowing coals, not vanishing, simply quieting, simply held, ready to be gently coaxed back to life whenever you are ready to meet tomorrow. There is a particular stretch of hedgerow along the lane leading out past the church, thick and tangled, and, at this time of year, still holding a few late blackberries that the birds have not yet managed to strip entirely, and Marjorie walked past it just yesterday afternoon, pausing long enough to eat 3 of them straight from the bramble, sharp and slightly sour in a way that made her screw up her face before reaching for a 4th anyway. The particular small, forgettable pleasure of a child snacking on something wild and free on an ordinary walk between one chore and the next. Nobody will remember this specific moment tomorrow, not even Marjorie herself, likely, within a week or 2. And yet it happened, exactly as described, a small true fragment of an entirely unremarkable Tuesday, one among countless thousands of such fragments that made up this family's whole life together, none of them individually significant, all of them, taken together, the actual substance of what it meant to be alive in this particular village, in this particular century, surrounded by these particular people who loved her. This is, I think, finally the truest thing I can tell you about a life like this one. And perhaps if you have followed me all the way here tonight, quietly and patiently through fire and bread and wool and worship, about your own ordinary and equally precious life as well. It was never really about the grand moments, the feast days, the weddings, the rare pilgrimage, or the occasional dramatic piece of village news. It was about this, mostly, the blackberries eaten on an ordinary walk, the fire banked the same careful way every single night, the small worn shoe hidden quietly in a chimney, the pewter spoon passed from father to son, thousands upon thousands of unremarkable moments, stacked one on top of another, forming in their sheer accumulated weight an entire complete and genuinely good life. Adam, deep in his own second sleep now, dreams briefly and forgettably of nothing more dramatic than the field he ploughed this very afternoon, the ox, the familiar weight of the plough handle in his grip, and it passes through him the way most dreams do, without waking him, without leaving behind anything he will remember or think to mention over breakfast tomorrow. Just one more small unrecorded fragment of an entire unrecorded inner life, exactly like Ellen's soft murmuring earlier, exactly like whatever half-formed images might be drifting, right now, through your own mind as sleep finally, gently, fully arrives. Somewhere beyond the reach of the small banked hearth, past the last dying warmth it can offer the far corners of the room, the cold autumn night presses gently against the timber walls of this house, and the house, as it has done for 4 generations now, simply holds, steady and patient, exactly as it was built to. There is nothing more this family needs to do tonight. There is nothing more you need to do tonight either. Let your own breathing slow now, the way this whole house slowed hours ago. Let your shoulders drop a little further into whatever you are resting on. Let your hands rest open and loose, wherever they happen to be, unclenched, the way Ellen's small hand finally loosened its grip on her grandmother's skirt somewhere in the deepest part of this night, without either of them ever noticing the exact moment it happened. Let your whole body grow heavier against whatever is holding you, the mattress, the pillow, the blanket pulled close, exactly the way this entire household, one by one, grew heavier against straw and rope and each other's warmth, until there was nothing left in the room but slow breathing and a single glowing ember, patient, steady, and utterly unhurried. There is nothing left to think about tonight, nothing left to solve, nothing left to plan. The fields are ploughed for the season, the pot is set for tomorrow. The animals are settled and the fire is banked, and every single person in that small fire-lit room we visited tonight is exactly where they need to be, safe, warm enough, breathing slow and even in the dark. You can let go now too. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day brought you here tonight, whatever small worries are still floating somewhere near the surface of your mind, let them settle the way the ash settled over those glowing coals, not gone, not erased, simply banked, quieted, held safely until morning without needing your attention a moment longer tonight. Morning will come, for you, exactly as it always does, and whatever needs doing then can wait until then. Right now, there is only this, the dark, the quiet, the slow, steady, unhurried rhythm of your own breath, in and out, exactly the same rhythm that carried Adam and Alison and Marjorie and Watt and Ellen and Cecily through this very night, exactly the same rhythm that has carried every sleeping household in every century safely through to another morning. Sleep well. I will be here again with another story, another quiet room somewhere in history, another small firelit household waiting patiently across the centuries to be visited whenever you are ready to find it. For now, though, there is nothing left to do but rest, nothing left to hold on to, nothing left but this slow, steady, unhurried drift into sleep, exactly the way this whole small household drifted into it hours ago, and exactly the way it will drift into it again tomorrow night, and the night after that, for as long as there is a fire to bank and a family to gather quietly around it,